In the basement of Prague's National Archive, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and rows of climate-controlled storage, a restoration specialist named Helena Moravec was doing what she had done for 23 years, carefully dismantling the past to preserve it. The manuscript on her table dated to 1362, a minor religious text, prayers and psalms, copied by monks whose names no one remembered. She had removed the leather binding to repair water damage when her scalpel caught on something unexpected. A sealed compartment, invisible from the outside, hidden within the spine itself. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, folded 3 times and sealed with black wax. Helena should have followed protocol. She should have called her supervisor, documented the find, initiated the standard authentication process. Instead, in that quiet room, she broke the seal. The wax crumbled like ash. The parchment unfolded in her hands, releasing the faint smell of old ink, and something else, something that smelled like smoke, like urgency, like secrets kept too long. The text was in medieval Latin, the handwriting precise and official. At the top, a date, October 1347. Below that, a list of names, titles, land holdings. And then, 3 words that made Helena's hands tremble. House of Silvania. She photographed it immediately, sent the images to colleagues in Vienna, Munich, Oxford. Within hours, the responses came back, and they all said the same thing. This document should not exist. Carbon dating confirmed the parchment's age. Paleographic analysis matched the handwriting style to mid-14th century chancellery scripts. The ink composition was consistent with period-appropriate materials. Every scientific test said it was authentic. But the content was impossible. The House of Silvania appeared in no genealogical record, no royal register, no historical chronicle. There was no Kingdom of Silvania on any map, no mention in papal archives, no trace in the exhaustive documentation of medieval European dynasties. It was as if someone had written a birth certificate for a person who never lived, except that every forensic test confirmed they had. How does an entire royal dynasty disappear so completely that even the internet, with its millions of historical entries, has no memory of them? How does a family that apparently ruled for 2 centuries leave behind nothing but a single hidden document and a date, October 1347? The same autumn, the Black Death first reached European shores from the east, carried on merchant ships from the Crimea, spreading faster than news of its approach. Helena and her colleagues began searching. Not for more documents, they assumed there were none, but for evidence that this was an elaborate hoax, a modern forgery, a historical prank. What they found instead was far more disturbing. Over the next 14 months, similar documents surfaced in 5 other European archives. A fragment in Budapest, hidden in a tax ledger. A sealed letter in Krakow, discovered behind a false wall during renovation. A merchant's diary in Venice with a single page torn out except the ghost impression of the writing remained, and when photographed under ultraviolet light, it mentioned Silvania. Every document dated to the same narrow window, 1345 to 1347. Every document mentioned the same royal house. And every document had been deliberately hidden, as if someone, long ago, had tried to erase this family from existence, but couldn't quite destroy every trace. 3 possibilities emerged. Either these documents represented a coordinated modern forgery, unlikely, given their dispersal across 6 archives in 4 countries, or there had been a catastrophic event so complete that an entire kingdom disappeared overnight. Or, most disturbing of all, someone in the 14th century had systematically erased the House of Silvania from history, and we were only now discovering the evidence of that erasure. But to understand why they vanished, we first need to know who they were, and that story begins 200 years earlier, in a place that no longer exists on any map. Pull up a medieval map of Europe from the year 1300. You'll see the Holy Roman Empire sprawling across Germany, the Kingdom of France to the west, England, Castile, the Italian city-states, Bohemia, Hungary, Poland. Every major power, every minor duchy, every prince-bishopric, all carefully labelled, their borders drawn with the obsessive detail medieval cartographers were famous for. Now look at Central Europe, at the region between Bohemia and Hungary, stretching toward the Carpathian foothills. You'll see trees, generic forest imagery, blank space, as if the cartographers simply forgot to fill in that particular section of the map. Except medieval mapmakers didn't forget things like that. Cartography in the Middle Ages was more than geography, it was political. Maps were statements of power, of legitimacy, of who mattered and who didn't. When a region appeared on a map, it existed in the consciousness of Europe. When it didn't, there was usually a reason. Historians call this cartographic silence. It happens when mapmakers deliberately leave spaces blank, not because they lack information, but because they've been instructed to. We see it in ancient Egypt, where pharaohs erased their predecessors from temple walls. We see it in Rome, where the Senate decreed damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of memory for emperors who fell from favor. Their names chiseled from monuments, their faces scraped from coins, their existence deleted from official history. The empty space in Central Europe exhibits the same pattern. It's too consistent, too deliberate. Surrounding kingdoms are mapped with precision, but this region remains vague, undefined, as if someone drew a line around it and said, "Here, we do not look." But 3 maps do show something there. A 1289 Venetian trade map, created for merchants, marks the region as Regno Silvaniae, the Kingdom of Silvania. A 1312 letter from the papal archives references the Silvanian crown in a dispute over church appointments. And a merchant's diary from 1344, discovered in Dubrovnik, mentions trade with the Forest Kingdom, describing a journey through mountain passes to a city whose name the merchant couldn't spell, but described in detail. Stone towers, a cathedral with black marble columns, markets selling amber and furs. These aren't legends. These are commercial documents, bureaucratic records, the mundane paperwork of medieval life. They mention Silvania, the way they mention Poland or Hungary, as a real place, a trading partner, a political entity that mattered. Modern satellite imagery reveals something else. In the region where Silvania should have been, beneath the forest canopy that has regrown over centuries, there are patterns, geometric shapes visible only from above, rectangular formations that match medieval city layouts, linear ridges that suggest buried roads, circular depressions where stone foundations have caused the earth to settle differently than the surrounding soil. Something was there, something substantial, and then, between 1346 and 1347, it disappeared from every official map, every royal register, every historical chronicle. The cartographers drew trees where a nation had been. They filled the space with silence. This empty space on the map wasn't always empty. Once, it held a kingdom that rivaled any in Europe, a kingdom with castles, armies, and a royal bloodline that traced back to Charlemagne himself. Their name? The House of Silvania. And their story begins in blood and ambition. Here's what mainstream history tells us about 14th century Europe. The 100 Years' War began in 1337, with England and France locked in a dynastic struggle that would last for generations. The Pope had moved to Avignon, creating a crisis of legitimacy in the Catholic Church. City-states in Italy were rising to unprecedented wealth and power. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting into a patchwork of competing principalities. And in 1347, ships from the Black Sea brought the plague to European shores, beginning the catastrophe we call the Black Death. What history doesn't mention is Silvania. Not in university textbooks, not in comprehensive atlases, not in the exhaustive genealogies that trace every European royal house back centuries. It's as if this kingdom never existed, and yet the evidence says otherwise. You're probably thinking this sounds impossible, like alternate history fiction, like the kind of story someone makes up for entertainment. We thought so too. Until the documents kept appearing, until the carbon dating came back, until the archaeological surveys began revealing patterns in the earth that matched medieval urban planning, until genetic studies of regional populations showed bloodlines that don't fit established migration patterns, until linguists noticed place names in remote villages that don't derive from any known language family in the area. The methodology here isn't speculation, it's detective work. We've examined primary sources, church records that survived in monastery archives, tax documents from neighbouring kingdoms that mention payments to the Silvanian crown, merchant ledgers recording trade goods and routes. We've analysed archaeological evidence from sites that official history attributes to other causes. We've studied oral traditions in mountain villages where old people still tell stories about the vanished kings, tales dismissed as folklore but remarkably consistent in their details. History is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors erase an entire kingdom so thoroughly that even scholars forget it existed? What happens when the erasure is so complete that the absence itself becomes invisible? This is that story. A mystery 7 centuries in the making, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice the hole where a nation used to be. Our journey begins in the year 1147, exactly 200 years before the disappearance. In the forests of Central Europe, a bastard prince with no claim to any throne is about to change the course of history. His name was Vladislav the Wolf, and his descendants would rule for 9 generations before vanishing in a single, terrible year. Every kingdom needs a founding myth, and most of them are lies, stories polished over generations until the truth disappears beneath layers of legend. But Silvania's founding was documented by witnesses who had no reason to lie, recorded in church archives by monks who cared only about facts, preserved in papal letters that treated this new kingdom as unremarkable, just another piece on Europe's political chessboard. It began with a man who shouldn't have mattered. Vladislav was born in 1121, the illegitimate son of a minor Hungarian nobleman and a Slavic noblewoman from a family that had lost its lands decades earlier. His father's legitimate children wanted nothing to do with him. His mother's people considered him a half-breed, contaminated by Hungarian blood. By his 20th birthday, Vladislav had been rejected by both cultures, denied inheritance, stripped of titles he'd never officially held. So he did what desperate men have always done. He went to the frontier, to the places no one else wanted. The Carpathian forests in the mid-12th century were considered worthless, too dense to farm, too rugged to traverse, too isolated to tax. The few people living there were remnants of older populations, pagan communities that still worshipped forest gods, villages that spoke languages no scholar recognized, tribes that had been pushed into the mountains by successive waves of conquest and had learned that survival meant invisibility. Vladislav didn't conquer them, he married into them. His first wife was the daughter of a tribal elder, his second was the widow of a local warlord. Through marriage, through trade agreements, through promises of protection, he built a network of alliances in a region where force alone would have failed. And then he did something brilliant. He converted them to Christianity. Not forcefully, not through crusade or inquisition. He brought priests who learned the local languages, who incorporated local festivals into Christian holy days, who turned forest shrines into chapels. By 1160, the pagan tribes had become Christian communities, and Vladislav sent word to Rome that he had peacefully brought thousands of souls into the church. The Pope was delighted. In 1163, a papal bull granted Vladislav the title Protector of the Forest Lands and gave him authority to build churches, appoint clergy, and collect tithes. It was the recognition he needed. With papal backing, he could negotiate with neighbouring kingdoms as an equal, not a frontier bandit. Hungarian nobles who had dismissed him now had to acknowledge that he controlled a region they'd ignored, and that region was now officially Christian territory under Rome's protection. By 1175, Vladislav controlled enough territory, approximately 35,000 square kilometers, to declare himself king. Not through conquest, but through consolidation. King Vladislav I of Silvania. The name itself was deliberate. Silva, the Latin word for forest, combined with a Slavic suffix. A kingdom that belonged to no single culture, but drew from all of them. The papal bull of 1177, discovered in Vatican archives in 2003, explicitly recognizes Vladislav, Rex Silvaniae, and grants him the right to mint coins and levy taxes, the fundamental marks of sovereignty. He wasn't a legend. He wasn't a myth. He was a king, acknowledged by the highest authority in medieval Europe. Architectural evidence supports this. Several castles scattered across modern Romania and Slovakia exhibit a unique hybrid-style Hungarian stonework, combined with Slavic wooden fortifications and Byzantine defensive features. They don't match any known kingdom's architectural tradition. They're orphaned structures, built by a culture historians can't identify. But if you assume they were Silvanian, they make perfect sense. They're exactly what you'd expect from a kingdom that blended 3 cultures into something new. Village names tell the same story. Dozens of settlements in the region contain the root Silva or Van, Silvanova, Silvade, Vaneshti, Vanko. They cluster in a specific geographic area, suggesting systematic naming by a centralized authority. Someone, long ago, named these villages according to a pattern. That someone was probably Silvanian. Vladislav died in 1183, having transformed a wilderness into a kingdom. His son would consolidate it. His grandson would make it wealthy. His great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson would watch it disappear. Vladislav's kingdom was built on secrets, secret alliances, secret trade routes, secret religious practices that blended Christianity with older traditions. Perhaps it's fitting that such a kingdom would disappear into secrecy, but for 200 years, Silvania thrived. Its second king would make it powerful, its fifth king would make it rich, and its ninth king would lead it into oblivion. Close your eyes and imagine standing at the edge of a medieval forest. Not the tame, managed woodlands of modern Europe, but the primordial forests of the 13th century. Oak and beech trees so tall, their canopies block the sun, creating a permanent twilight on the forest floor. Rivers cutting through limestone valleys. Mountain passes where the wind carries the smell of snow, even in summer. This was Silvania. Modern landscape analysis and historical ecology allow us to reconstruct the kingdom's geography with surprising precision. Silvania occupied approximately 35,000 square kilometers in what is now northeastern Romania, eastern Slovakia, and western Ukraine. Its borders were natural mountain ranges to the north and east, rivers to the south and west. The capital, called Silvapur, in the handful of documents that mention it, likely stood near modern Cluj-Napoca in Romania, positioned at the intersection of several river valleys that provided natural trade routes. The kingdom's economy rested on three foundations. First, timber. The forests provided oak for shipbuilding, a resource every maritime power in Europe desperately needed. Venetian merchant records from the 13th century mention purchasing Carpathian oak through intermediaries, and several shipwrecks in the Mediterranean have been found to contain oak species native to this specific region. Second, silver mining. Medieval mine shafts discovered in the Carpathian foothills show sophisticated 13th century mining techniques, ventilation systems, drainage channels, support structures indicating an organized, well-funded mining operation. And third, transit trade. Silvania controlled key mountain passes between the Baltic and Black Seas, allowing merchants to avoid the longer routes through Poland or Hungary. Trade meant customs fees, and customs fees meant wealth. But the kingdom's most fascinating aspect was its culture, a genuine melting pot centuries before that concept existed. Court documents, when they survive, show a lingua franca mixing Latin, Hungarian, and Slavic languages, sometimes within the same sentence. Noble families practiced an unusual form of collective rulership, with major decisions made by councils rather than royal decree alone. The common people maintained pre-Christian festivals despite official Christianity, bonfires on solstice nights, harvest rituals involving masks and dances, ceremonies at forest springs. These traditions haven't entirely disappeared. Folklore studies in modern Romania and Slovakia have documented festivals in certain villages with rituals unknown elsewhere in Europe. In the village of Silvana in Romania, locals still celebrate Night of the Nine Kings every October, lighting candles for monarchs they can't name but insist once ruled from the forest throne. In eastern Slovakia, several villages perform a harvest dance involving 9 dancers in masks, one for each generation of rulers, though the villagers themselves don't know what this means. Are these remnants of Silvanian traditions preserved through oral memory for 7 centuries? Or coincidence? Archaeological evidence is more concrete. Excavations in the region have uncovered coins bearing royal inscriptions that match no known medieval kingdom. The script appears to be a hybrid of Latin and Cyrillic alphabets. Pottery fragments show distinctive geometric patterns that don't match Hungarian, Polish, Romanian, or any other identified medieval tradition. Burial sites reveal urban populations with dental health and bone structure, indicating good nutrition and relatively long lifespans, markers of a prosperous, stable society. One discovery stands out. In 2007, construction workers near Cluj-Napoca unearthed the foundation of a large stone building, clearly medieval, with architectural features suggesting it was an administrative center or palace. The building had been deliberately demolished, its stones removed, its foundation filled with rubble. Someone had gone to considerable effort to erase it from the landscape. Carbon dating of charcoal in the rubble suggests demolition occurred in the mid to late 14th century. Imagine a kingdom hidden in plain sight, a place where 3 cultures merged, where ancient forests hid prosperous cities, where silver flowed from mountain mines and trade caravans crossed like arteries carrying the wealth of empires. It was real. It was there. And then, in 1347, it ceased to exist. For 2 centuries, Silvania existed in a delicate balance, powerful enough to defend itself, but not so powerful as to threaten its neighbours. Its kings married into Polish, Hungarian, and Bohemian royal houses. Its merchants traded with Venice, Novgorod, and Constantinople. Everything seemed stable. But in 1347, 3 catastrophes would converge on this hidden kingdom, and only one would be visible to history. 9 kings ruled Silvania across 2 centuries. 9 monarchs in an unbroken line, father to son, mother to daughter, each one building on what the previous generation had created. To understand what was lost in 1347, we need to know who they were. Vladislav I, the founder, ruled from 1147 to 1183. We've told his story, the bastard prince who became a king, but his son, Vladislav II, was the one who transformed a coalition of forest communities into an actual kingdom. He built the capital, Silvapa, importing stonemasons from Italy and architects from Byzantium. He established a royal mint, created a system of laws, and negotiated trade agreements with the Hanseatic League. By his death in 1201, Silvania was no longer an experiment, it was a functioning state. King Stephen I ruled from 1201 to 1229, and under his reign, Silvania became wealthy. The silver mines reached peak production. Timber exports doubled. Stephen's court became known across Europe for its cosmopolitan character. Hungarian nobles, Slavic warriors, German merchants, even a few Italian scholars, all gathered at Silvapur. One Venetian visitor described the royal palace as a place where 5 languages are spoken at dinner, and no one finds this strange. Then came Elena I, who ruled from 1229 to 1241, the first female monarch in Silvanian history, and possibly one of the few ruling queens in medieval Europe who held power in her own right, not as a regent. Elena inherited the throne at age 23 when her father died without male heirs. She had 12 years to prove herself, and she did. When Mongol raiders swept through Eastern Europe in 1241, destroying kingdoms and burning cities, Elena fortified Silvania's mountain passes and formed an all-female royal guard, a decision that scandalized neighboring kingdoms but proved effective. The Mongols bypassed Silvania, finding easier targets elsewhere. Her son, Mikhail I, ruled from 1241 to 1263, and spent his reign rebuilding what the Mongols had destroyed in neighboring regions. He married a Byzantine princess, strengthening ties to Constantinople, and built an astronomical observatory in Silvapur, a detail mentioned in a single surviving letter from a travelling scholar who described towers from which the king watches the stars and claims to read the future. Vladislav III presided over what historians would call Silvania's Golden Age, from 1263 to 1289. Under his rule, the kingdom reached its cultural peak: churches decorated with frescoes, monasteries copying manuscripts, craftsmen producing metalwork that rivaled anything from Venice or Paris. Archaeological evidence suggests the population reached its highest levels during this period. Stephen II, ruling from 1289 to 1312, was less successful. He fought a series of border wars with Hungary, trying to expand Silvania's territory. The wars achieved nothing except draining the royal treasury and making enemies of powerful neighbours. His attempt to join the Holy Roman Empire to gain imperial protection was rejected, leaving Silvania isolated. King Andrei I stabilized the situation from 1312 to 1334 by marrying into Polish nobility and securing the northeastern borders through diplomacy rather than war. He restored the treasury and re-established trade relationships that his father had damaged. By the time of his death, Silvania seemed secure again. And then came Vladislav IV, who inherited the crown in 1334 at age 19. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent, multilingual, devoted to his people. A merchant who visited Silvapur in 1346 wrote a letter describing the young king as learned in 4 languages, pious in his Christian faith, but troubled by dreams. He will not speak of dreams, he says, of fire and silence, and the forest reclaiming what men have built. 9 kings, 200 years, an unbroken line of succession, each generation strengthening what the previous had created. The 9th king inherited a thriving kingdom in 1334. 13 years later, he would be the last person to bear the Silvanian crown. What happened in those 13 years? What could erase not just a king, not just a dynasty, but an entire nation from the memory of Europe? The answer begins in January 1347, when the first ships carrying plague arrived in European ports. But the plague wasn't the only catastrophe heading towards Silvania. 2 others were coming, one political, one far stranger, and together they would accomplish what no army had ever managed: the complete erasure of a kingdom. The morning bells rang at dawn across Silvapa, echoing off stone walls and waking a city of 15,000 souls. For a medieval capital, this was substantially larger than most provincial towns, though nothing compared to Paris or Venice. But size wasn't what made Silvapa remarkable. It was the peculiar mix of cultures visible in every street corner, every market stall, every conversation overheard in the squares. The royal palace stood at the city's heart, built on a limestone outcrop that gave it commanding views of the surrounding valleys. Hungarian stonemasons had laid the foundations decades earlier, but Byzantine craftsmen had added mosaics to the Great Hall, geometric patterns in blue and gold that caught the morning light and threw it across the walls in shifting patterns. The throne room combined Western and Eastern aesthetics in ways that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. King Vladislav IV rose each morning before dawn. He was 36 years old in 1346, though portraits described in merchant accounts suggest he looked older, the weight of kingship perhaps, or the burden of his increasingly troubled sleep. His daily routine was documented in letters from visiting dignitaries, who described a king more scholar than warrior, morning audiences with petitioners seeking justice or favour, afternoons with councillors discussing trade agreements with Venetian merchants, border disputes with Hungarian nobles, church matters with papal representatives, evenings devoted to his library. That library was extraordinary. Over 300 manuscripts, collected across 20 years, religious texts, classical philosophy, Arabic mathematics, astronomical charts. For a small kingdom, this represented an almost obsessive commitment to learning. Vladislav could read Latin, Hungarian, German, and multiple Slavic dialects fluently. He corresponded with scholars in Prague, Vienna, and even distant Bologna. A visiting Venetian merchant wrote in 1343 that he'd found a court as refined as any in Christendom, where the king debates philosophy with his councillors and keeps astronomers to chart the heavens. Queen Isabella, his wife, was the daughter of a Polish duke. She'd married Vladislav in 1330, a political alliance that had secured Silvania's northern border. But the letters that survive suggest genuine affection between them. They had 2 children: Prince Vladislav, age 10, who was being trained in statecraft and warfare, and Princess Elena, age 8, who, according to one account, reads better than most grown men and argues theology with the palace priests. The court's inner circle included Father Gregor, a Bavarian monk who served as the king's chief counselor and confessor. There was Lord Dmitri, commander of the royal guard, a Slavic nobleman whose family had served the Silvanian crown for 3 generations. There were merchants who advised on trade, scribes who maintained records, physicians who tended to the royal family's health, and a small but sophisticated bureaucracy that kept the kingdom functioning. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts of cultural sophistication. Excavations near Cluj-Napoca have uncovered remnants of an advanced water supply system, ceramic pipes, bringing spring water into the city, a technology more common in Italy than Eastern Europe at this time. Trade records show literacy rates higher than neighbouring regions, suggesting a population accustomed to written contracts and documentation. The kingdom minted its own coins, collected its own taxes, maintained its own courts of law. Life in Silvapur during these years must have felt secure, even prosperous. The harvests from 1340 to 1346 were consistently good. Trade with Venice and the Hanseatic cities brought wealth into the treasury. The forests provided endless timber for export. The silver mines in the mountains continued producing. The kingdom's population was growing slowly but steadily. There were festivals in the city squares, markets that drew merchants from across Europe, churches where priests said mass in multiple languages. No one in Silvapur knew they were living through the final peaceful years of their kingdom's existence. No one except, perhaps, the king himself. because Vladislav's nights had become troubled. He slept poorly, waking before dawn drenched in sweat, unable to shake images from dreams he couldn't fully remember but couldn't forget. He told his wife the dreams were getting worse. He confided in Father Gregor that he saw visions of disaster. He began making strange preparations, ordering grain stockpiled beyond what was needed, reinforcing castle walls, sending portraits of his children to allied courts abroad, as if trying to ensure they'd be remembered even if everything else was forgotten. His counselors thought he was overreacting to stress. His wife worried about his health. His people noticed their king seemed distracted, haunted, increasingly consumed by a dread he couldn't articulate. But the king did see something coming. His dreams had begun showing him the future not with perfect clarity, but with enough truth to terrify him. He saw cities burning, rivers running black, his crown melting, his children's faces fading into darkness, and something else, repeated in dream after dream, a book burning, and with it the memory of everything he'd built. For 6 years, from 1340 to 1346, Silvania experienced peace and prosperity. The kingdom thrived. The royal family lived in comfort and security. 2 children played in palace gardens, unaware they would never grow old. No one saw the storm coming except the king, and no one believed him. But even as Silvania thrived, King Vladislav IV couldn't shake a growing dread that something terrible was approaching. Something that would consume not just his kingdom, but the very memory that it had ever existed. Medieval kings took their dreams seriously. In an age when God spoke through visions and demons tempted through nightmares, a monarch's dreams weren't dismissed as mere imagination. They were analysed by priests, interpreted by scholars, treated as messages that might determine policy or predict the future. Vladislav IV's dreams began sometime in early 1345. We know this from letters he wrote to his cousin, Bishop Tomasz of Krakow, letters discovered in a Polish archive in 1987, but never fully translated or analysed until recently. In them, the king describes nightmares that grew increasingly vivid and disturbing as months passed. At first, the dreams were fragmentary. Cities covered in darkness, rivers running black, his crown melting like wax in his hands. Unsettling, certainly, but not unprecedented. Rulers often dreamed of losing power, of kingdoms crumbling, of disasters befalling their people. Priests told him these were common anxieties, manifesting during sleep, nothing more. But the dreams didn't stop. They intensified. By May 1346, Vladislav was writing to his cousin in desperate terms. One letter describes a great wind from the east, carrying with it the breath of death, and in its wake, nothing lives, nothing grows, nothing remains. Historians reading this now recognize something chilling. It sounds like a description of the plague, which did indeed come from the east, originating in Central Asia and spreading westward along trade routes. But in May 1346, the plague hadn't yet reached Europe. Vladislav couldn't have known about it through normal channels. Could he have heard rumours from Eastern merchants? Possibly. Could his dream have been coincidentally accurate? Perhaps. Or could some part of his mind have sensed the approaching catastrophe in ways we don't fully understand? The dreams contained other elements harder to explain. He repeatedly dreamed of a book burning, and with it, all memory of his kingdom disappearing. He saw his children's faces fading like watercolour in rain. He watched his palace crumble to ruins and forests growing through the stones. These weren't vague anxieties, they were specific, detailed visions of erasure, of his entire dynasty being forgotten by history. In his final letter to Bishop Tomasz, dated January 1347, Vladislav wrote, "I no longer sleep more than 2 hours each night. When I close my eyes, I see the end of all things. My counselors believe I am losing my mind. My wife fears for my health. But I know what I see is true. Something is coming that will sweep away everything we have built. I pray I am wrong. I fear I am not." Medieval people believed God sent warnings through dreams. If Vladislav's dreams were warnings, they were remarkably accurate, but they came too late to save anyone. By early 1347, the dreams had intensified to the point where the king barely slept. He spent nights pacing the palace corridors, making preparations his counselors couldn't understand. He stockpiled grain. He reinforced walls. He sent letters to allied courts, letters that read like farewells. His wife was worried. His children were confused. His people whispered that their king was going mad. None of them knew that thousands of miles away, The first plague ships had already left ports on the Black Sea, carrying death westward. Every kingdom has weaknesses. Every nation faces potential threats to its survival. But Silvania, in 1347, was uniquely vulnerable in ways that would prove catastrophic when multiple crises converged simultaneously. The first vulnerability was geographic. The same forested mountains that had protected Silvania for 2 centuries also isolated it. The kingdom had only 3 main roads, connecting it to neighboring regions, and all 3 passed through narrow mountain passes that could be blocked by snow in winter, by fallen trees in storms, by hostile armies in war. This defensive advantage became a deadly trap when the kingdom needed help, when its people needed escape routes, when rapid communication with the outside world became essential. Compare this to other medieval kingdoms. France had dozens of major roads radiating from Paris. Italy's city-states were interconnected by well-traveled routes. Even mountainous Switzerland had multiple passes allowing movement and trade. Silvania's geographic isolation meant that in times of crisis, the kingdom was essentially cut off. Messages took weeks to reach neighboring courts. Help, if it came at all, arrived too late. And if the population needed to flee, there were only 3 ways out, 3 bottlenecks that could become death traps if thousands tried to use them simultaneously. The second vulnerability was political. Silvania had survived for 2 centuries through a delicate balancing act, remaining strong enough to defend itself, but not so strong as to threaten its neighbors, maintaining trade relationships with multiple kingdoms, while avoiding permanent alliances that might drag it into wars. This worked during stable times. During crisis, it meant Silvania had no reliable allies. Hungary had never fully accepted Silvania's independence. The Hungarian crown maintained ancient territorial claims to the region, claims that were mostly ignored during peaceful decades, but never formally renounced. Poland saw Silvania's trade routes as strategically valuable, and had repeatedly proposed treaties that would essentially turn the kingdom into a Polish vassal state. The Holy Roman Empire viewed the entire region as potential expansion territory. Documents from 1344 to 1346 show increasing diplomatic pressure from all 3 powers, with neighboring kings making territorial demands, threatening military action if their terms weren't met, and generally treating Silvania as a minor kingdom whose independence was negotiable. Vladislav IV had spent years managing these pressures through careful diplomacy, but by 1347, the situation was deteriorating. A letter from a Hungarian noble to his king, intercepted by Silvanian spies, described the kingdom as ripe for annexation, and suggested that a minor crisis would provide adequate pretext for intervention. The subtext was clear. Silvania's powerful neighbors were waiting for an excuse to divide its territory among themselves. The third and perhaps most critical vulnerability was demographic. Medieval kingdoms survived through population you needed enough people to farm the land, defend the borders, maintain infrastructure, collect taxes, and sustain the economy. Silvania's total population was approximately 200,000 people. For context, France had 17 million, England had 4 million. Even smaller kingdoms like Denmark had close to 500,000. This meant that Silvania had no demographic cushion, a disaster that killed 30% of the population. A typical mortality rate for plague-affected regions would leave the kingdom with approximately 140,000 people. That might sound sustainable, but medieval demographics were more fragile than modern ones. You needed a critical mass of people to maintain roads, operate mills, defend castles, conduct trade, support cities. Fall below that critical mass, and infrastructure began failing, which caused more deaths, which caused further infrastructure failure, a death spiral that small populations couldn't reverse. Archaeological evidence and economic analysis suggest Silvania was already near the lower limit of viability. Its population density was among the lowest in Europe, approximately 5 to 6 people per square kilometre, compared to 20 to 30 in France, or 15 to 20 in most German principalities. The kingdom functioned because it was carefully organised, because its trade routes were profitable enough to compensate for low tax revenues, because its forests and mines provided resources that could be sold abroad. But this efficiency came at a cost. There was no redundancy, no backup systems, no reserve capacity. Furthermore, Silvania's multi-ethnic character, usually a strength, became a weakness during crisis. The kingdom's population was roughly 40% Slavic, 30% Hungarian, 20% Germanic, and 10% other groups. refugees from Mongol invasions, Jewish merchants, Italian craftsmen. This diversity had created a vibrant, cosmopolitan culture, but it also meant that in times of extreme stress, when resources became scarce and survival instincts took over, populations often reverted to ethnic loyalties. A unified kingdom could fragment along cultural fault lines, with different groups blaming each other for the crisis, competing for limited resources, or simply fleeing back to their ancestral homelands rather than staying to defend Silvania. Modern analysts looking at Silvania's structural situation in early 1347 would recognize what medieval observers couldn't see clearly. The kingdom was a house of cards, stable as long as nothing disturbed it, functioning as long as all the pieces stayed in balance. But one major shock would be enough to bring the entire structure crashing down. 2 simultaneous shocks would be catastrophic, 3 would be utterly annihilating, and Silvania was about to face not one crisis, but 3, arriving almost simultaneously. A biological catastrophe, the plague, killing indiscriminately across Europe. A political catastrophe, neighbouring powers seeing opportunity in Silvania's weakness. And a third catastrophe, still not fully explained, that would make the first 2 irrelevant by erasing the kingdom so completely that even its memory would nearly vanish from history. Every kingdom has vulnerabilities. But Silvania had a unique problem. It was too small to matter and too isolated to get help. In peaceful times, this was manageable. In 1347, it would be fatal. As winter turned to spring in early 1347, King Vladislav IV faced a kingdom on the edge. His dreams warned of catastrophe. His counselors reported diplomatic failures. His scouts brought news of strange illnesses spreading through trading cities to the south and east. And then, in March 1347, the first messenger arrived from Kaffa on the Black Sea, bringing news of a plague unlike any in living memory. He brought something else too, though no one realized it at the time. He brought the disease itself. January 1347 arrived cold and clear across Silvania. Snow covered the forests in white silence, muffling sound, transforming the landscape into something pristine and peaceful. In Silverpore, the capital celebrated Epiphany with traditional festivities, church bells ringing across the frozen morning, priests blessing water drawn from the river, families gathering for feasts of roasted meat and spiced wine. The royal palace hosted nobles from across the kingdom, and King Vladislav IV stood before them looking tired but composed, raising a cup to toast the new year and pray for continued prosperity. He was writing letters during these weeks, seeking a marriage alliance for his 10-year-old son with a Bohemian noble family. The correspondence was optimistic, full of plans for the future, discussions of dowries and treaty terms that would strengthen Silvania's western ties. His wife, Queen Isabella, was in her early stages of pregnancy with their 3rd child. The palace physicians assured them everything was progressing well. Princess Elena, age 8, was learning Latin from Father Gregor, showing a natural aptitude for languages. Life in the royal household followed its familiar rhythms: morning prayers, afternoon audiences, evening meals, where the king's councillors discussed trade figures and border patrols, and the mundane business of governing. Nothing suggested this would be the last normal January Silvania would ever see. February brought the first thaw, rivers breaking free of ice, roads becoming passable again after winter's isolation. Merchants returned to Silvapa from their winter quarters, bringing goods accumulated during months of travel. Byzantine silks, Venetian glassware, German metalwork, furs from the Baltic, the markets filled with voices haggling in multiple languages, the smell of fresh bread mixing with the sharper scent of tanned leather and wood smoke from forges. Trade had always been Silvania's lifeblood, and February marked the annual renewal of commercial activity. One merchant arriving from Constantinople mentioned rumours of a strange pestilence far to the east, in Mongol territories. People dying rapidly, entire villages abandoned, something about swellings and fever. But the east was always full of rumours, wars, famines, diseases that never reached Europe. The king's councillors noted the report, but dismissed it as distant and irrelevant. Silvania had its own concerns: border tensions with Hungary, a dispute over mining rights, a monastery requesting funds for repairs. The king's nightmares continued, but he'd learned to function despite broken sleep. His wife noticed he spent more time in prayer, more hours in his library reading theological texts about apocalypse and judgment. She worried quietly, but said nothing to others. The children noticed their father seemed distracted, but children adapt quickly to adult moods, and life continued normally for them: lessons, play, the secure routines of childhood in a protected palace. March arrived with early spring, and with it, the first real signs that something was wrong in the wider world. A trade caravan from Wallachia, travelling from Black Sea ports, brought more than goods. They brought stories that made even skeptical merchants pause. Mass deaths in trading cities. Entire families dying within days of falling ill. Bodies piling in streets faster than gravediggers could work. Some cities closing their gates, refusing entry to travellers. Others simply emptying as survivors fled. The Silvanian merchants who heard these stories faced a dilemma. Continue trading and risk encountering whatever this disease was, or cease travel and lose income. Most chose to wait, to see what happened next. Trade slowed noticeably in late March. King Vladislav convened his council to discuss whether Silvania should close its borders. The debate lasted hours. Closing borders would devastate the kingdom's economy. Trade provided perhaps 40% of royal revenues. But keeping borders open risked. What exactly? Disease had always existed. Plagues came and went. Medieval people lived with constant low-level infectious disease. Was this really different? The councillors were divided. Lord Dmitri argued for military closure of the passes. Father Gregor suggested prayer and penance might be more effective than quarantine. The merchants' representative warned that closed borders would bankrupt the kingdom within months. Queen Isabella, attending the council, asked a simple question. If we close the borders and the disease never reaches us, we'll be safe but poor. If we keep them open, and it does reach us, we'll be dying and rich. Which is preferable? The king decided on a compromise: limited inspection of travellers, temporary closure of the largest markets, increased hygiene measures in the city. It was reasonable. It was rational. It was measured and cautious. It was also completely inadequate. January, February, March of 1347. These were the last normal months in Silvanian history. People lived their lives, made plans for futures that would never come, celebrated traditions that would never be repeated. Everything seemed eternal. Everything was already ending. April would bring the first deaths. May would bring panic. June would bring decisions that could never be undone. But before we enter the nightmare, we need to understand the three forces that would converge on Silvania in 1347. Three catastrophes that separately were manageable, but together were apocalyptic. The first was the plague. The second was war. The third is why Silvania was erased from history. The plague that would kill 50 million people began in the steppes of Central Asia, in rodent populations carrying a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It spread along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and armies, moving westward through trade routes that connected east and west. By late 1346, it had reached the Black Sea. The city of Kaffa, on the Crimean coast, was a Genoese trading colony, a place where Italian merchants met Eastern caravans, where silk and spices from Asia were loaded onto ships bound for Venice and Genoa. In autumn 1346, Mongol forces besieging the city began dying of a mysterious illness. According to chronicles written by survivors, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls before withdrawing. Whether this act of biological warfare actually spread the disease is debated, but the image haunted medieval minds: death literally raining from the sky. What isn't debated is what happened next. Genoese merchants, fleeing Kaffa as the plague spread through the city, sailed to Constantinople, then to Mediterranean ports, carrying infected rats in their cargo holds. Each ship that docked brought the disease to a new city. Constantinople reported deaths by January 1347, Ragusa in February, Split in March. The plague moved faster than news of its approach, faster than any defense could be mounted. Medieval people had no concept of bacteria or infection vectors. They understood the plague through the frameworks available to them: divine punishment for sin, corruption of the air caused by earthquakes or comets, astrological misalignment, or poisoning of wells by scapegoated groups. They tried remedies that ranged from useless to actively harmful: bloodletting, burning aromatic herbs, fleeing infected areas, and thereby spreading the disease further, or killing Jewish communities in pogroms based on conspiracy theories. Quarantine existed as a concept, but implementation was primitive. Some cities began refusing entry to travelers from infected regions. Some required visitors to wait outside city walls for 40 days before entering, the origin of the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni. But enforcement was inconsistent. and 40 days was longer than most cities could maintain a complete blockade without starving. The disease itself was horrific in its symptoms and swiftness. Bubonic plague caused swellings in the lymph nodes buboes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. These became blackened and agonizingly painful. Victims developed high fever, vomiting, weakness. Death usually came within 3 to 7 days of symptom onset. Pneumonic plague, which developed when the infection reached the lungs, was even deadlier and could spread person to person through coughing. Mortality rates ranged from 40 to 60% of infected populations in most cities. By April 1347, the plague had reached Hungary, moving northwest through the Balkans along trade routes that led directly toward Silvania. Every road that had brought prosperity to the Forest Kingdom would now bring death. Geographic isolation had protected Silvania from many threats across 2 centuries, but the kingdom's economy depended on trade, and trade meant contact with the infected world. Maps showing the plague's spread reveal an inexorable pattern it followed: rivers, roads, shipping routes, advancing at roughly 2 to 5 kilometers per day through densely populated regions, slower through rural areas but never stopping. Italy would lose half its population. France would lose a third. England would see villages simply disappear, their inhabitants dead or fled, their fields returning to wilderness. The Black Death would kill approximately 1/3 of Europe's total population over 4 years. It was the worst demographic catastrophe in recorded history. Kingdoms fell into chaos. Trade collapsed. Fields went unplanted. Cities burned as authorities tried to cleanse infected buildings. But most kingdoms survived. Their names remained in chronicles. Their dynasties continued. Their territories were eventually repopulated and rebuilt. France remained France. England remained England. Italy's city-states emerged from the plague diminished but intact. Silvania would not be so lucky, because Silvania faced something else beyond the plague, something that would turn a survivable catastrophe into an erasure so complete that even the kingdom's existence would be nearly forgotten. As the plague crept closer through April 1347, King Vladislav IV faced an impossible choice: close the borders and risk economic collapse, or stay open and risk infection. He chose a middle path: limited quarantine, inspection of travelers, temporary market closures. It was reasonable, it was rational, it was completely inadequate. By May, the first cases appeared in Silvanian villages. By June, they reached the capital, and by July, the king faced a different crisis entirely. An army was marching toward his borders. King Louis I of Hungary was 20 years old in 1347, young and ambitious, eager to prove himself to nobles who remembered his father as a great warrior. Louis would later be called Louis the Great, and he would spend his reign expanding Hungarian power across Central Europe. But in spring 1347, he was still establishing his reputation, still looking for opportunities to demonstrate strength. Silvania presented exactly such an opportunity. Hungarian claims to Silvanian territory had existed for 2 centuries, ever since Vladislav the Wolf had carved out his forest kingdom from what Hungary considered its rightful borders. These claims were mostly ignored during peaceful decades, but they'd never been formally renounced. Hungary maintained that Silvania was illegitimate, that the region belonged by ancient right to the Hungarian crown, that the Silvanian kings were essentially usurpers, occupying stolen land. Louis had been raised hearing these arguments. More importantly, he wanted what Silvania possessed: silver mines that produced wealth, forests that provided valuable timber, and trade routes connecting the Black Sea to Central Europe. Control of those routes would increase Hungarian customs revenue significantly. By April 1347, Hungarian scouts were reporting that Silvania was weakening. Plague had begun disrupting trade. Border garrisons were undermanned. The kingdom's attention was focused inward on containing disease rather than defending frontiers. To an ambitious young king, this looked like opportunity. Letters in Hungarian royal archives, which survived, unlike Silvanian records, show Louis consulting with his advisors about invasion timing. One letter from late April states bluntly, "The forest kingdom is dying. We shall take what remains." There's no indication Louis felt any moral qualms about invading a plague-stricken neighbour. Medieval politics operated on opportunism. Weakness invited attack. Compassion was a luxury reserved for allies, and Silvania had no formal alliance with Hungary. In May 1347, Hungarian forces, approximately 5,000 soldiers, crossed into Silvania's southern border region. They encountered minimal resistance. Many Silvanian garrison commanders had abandoned their posts, either fleeing the approaching plague or dying from it. Soldiers were dying faster than replacements could be recruited. The few skirmishes that occurred were one-sided, with Hungarian forces easily overwhelming disorganized Silvanian defenses. By early June, Hungarian forces had captured several border fortresses and were advancing toward the interior. King Vladislav IV faced an impossible dilemma that medieval rulers dreaded: simultaneous threats that required contradictory responses. Fighting Hungary required pulling troops from plague containment efforts, concentrating forces at borders, and potentially allowing infected populations to flee unchecked through the kingdom. Focusing on plague containment meant abandoning border defenses and losing territory. The king chose to negotiate. He sent envoys to Louis, with offers designed to satisfy Hungarian ambitions, without complete capitulation, tribute payments, territorial adjustments in Hungary's favour, trade concessions, formal recognition of Hungarian overlordship in certain border regions. These were significant concessions that would have weakened Silvania, but preserved its core territory and independence. Louis refused. His response, preserved in Hungarian archives, was clear: unconditional surrender. He demanded that Vladislav IV abdicate, that Silvania be fully incorporated into Hungary, that the royal family submit to Hungarian authority. In essence, he demanded the kingdom cease to exist as an independent entity. Vladislav couldn't accept those terms. To surrender completely would mean betraying 2 centuries of Silvanian independence, abandoning his people to foreign rule, and rendering meaningless every sacrifice his ancestors had made. But continuing to resist meant fighting a war the kingdom couldn't win, while simultaneously battling a plague it couldn't stop. By July, Vladislav had lost approximately a quarter of his population to plague, and a third of his territory to Hungary. Hungarian forces were within a week's march of Silvapur. The capital itself was experiencing deaths daily from disease. The kingdom was collapsing from 2 directions simultaneously, and the king had exhausted his conventional options. But he had one option left. A desperate, dangerous option that had been whispered about in his court for decades. An option that involved secrets kept since his great-grandfather's reign. An option that, if discovered by his enemies, would give them the justification they needed to erase Silvania from history forever. Every kingdom has secrets. Some involve money, others involve bloodlines, still others involve compromises made long ago that seemed harmless at the time, but become dangerous when circumstances change. Silvania's secret was religious, and in medieval Europe, religious secrets were the most dangerous kind. When Vladislav the Wolf founded his forest kingdom in the 1142, the region he claimed was only nominally Christian. The tribal populations living in the Carpathian forests had been officially converted during previous centuries, but conversion often meant little more than building a church in a village, while the old ways continued in private. Slavic nature worship, honoring forest spirits, river gods, seasonal cycles remained deeply embedded in daily life. Mixed with these were even older traditions from Dacian peoples who had inhabited the region before Slavic migrations, practices involving sacred groves, divination through animal bones, rituals performed at specific times of year to ensure harvests or protect against disease. Vladislav needed papal recognition to legitimize his kingdom, so he presented himself as a Christian monarch bringing true faith to pagan lands. Rome was delighted, but the reality was more complex. Vladislav understood that forcibly eliminating the old practices would alienate his subjects and destroy the delicate alliances he'd built, so he allowed a compromise. Official Christianity for public life, quiet tolerance for traditional practices in private. Churches were built, priests were appointed, mass was celebrated, but harvest festivals continued with barely Christianized pagan elements. Winter solstice celebrations honored both Christ's birth and older solar deities. Healers called wise women practiced herbal medicine while claiming to communicate with forest spirits. This syncretic spirituality became Silvania's defining characteristic, a blending of Christian and pre-Christian traditions that unified the kingdom's diverse population, but would be considered deeply heretical by strict Catholic authorities. The royal court officially participated in all Catholic sacraments. They attended Mass, received communion, made pilgrimages. But they also maintained sacred groves in the palace gardens, consulted diviners during crises, and performed rituals that mixed Christian prayers with ancient incantations. For 2 centuries, this secret remained contained. Visiting church officials might notice unusual practices but rarely understood their full implications. A letter from a Catholic bishop who visited Silvania in 1298 mentions disturbing practices at the royal court, but doesn't elaborate, suggesting either he didn't fully grasp what he was seeing or chose diplomatic silence. Archaeological evidence supports these claims. Excavations of Silvanian-era churches reveal structures that are outwardly Catholic, but contain strange architectural features: hidden chambers beneath altars, carved symbols on foundation stones that predate Christianity, burial practices that don't match Orthodox Catholic tradition. One chapel discovered near Cluj-Napoca in 2011 contained both a Christian altar and, hidden beneath floor stones, a carved representation of a tree with human faces emerging from its branches, clearly a pagan sacred tree motif. The secret remained manageable until July 1347, when King Vladislav IV faced the convergence of plague and invasion and made a desperate decision. Traditional Christian prayers hadn't stopped the dying. Military strategy hadn't stopped the Hungarian advance. The kingdom his ancestors had built was collapsing, so he turned to older methods. In secret, witnessed only by his closest advisors, Vladislav performed a protection ritual combining Christian prayers with ancient rites passed down through generations of Silvanian monarchs. The exact details are lost, but fragments suggest it involved offerings made in a sacred grove, invocations to both Christ and older protective spirits, and symbolic actions meant to shield the kingdom from harm. It was an act of desperation by a dying king trying any method, however forbidden, to save his people. But someone witnessed what shouldn't have been witnessed. A spy in the court, possibly a Hungarian agent, possibly a genuinely horrified Catholic who believed he was witnessing sorcery, sent word to both Rome and Buda. The letters described the king's heretical practices, invocations of demons, abandonment of Christian faith in favor of pagan sorcery. This changed everything. Hungary's invasion, which had been a straightforward territorial grab, suddenly became a holy crusade against heretics. King Louis I could now claim he wasn't conquering a Christian kingdom, but eliminating a nest of paganism that had masqueraded as Christian for 2 centuries. Papal authorities, already dealing with the chaos of the Black Death, saw an opportunity to demonstrate the Church's power by punishing heresy dramatically. In August 1347, the Pope issued a secret bull, never publicly announced, never formally published, declaring Silvania a heretical kingdom whose existence was an affront to Christendom. All Catholic monarchs were encouraged to participate in its correction. Hungary received explicit blessing to conquer the territory, and most ominously, the Pope ordered that all records of Silvania be purified, a medieval euphemism for destruction. The kingdom would die, and its name would die with it. Not because of plague, not because of military defeat, but because Vladislav's desperate ritual had exposed the secret his dynasty had kept for 200 years. The ritual failed to save the kingdom. Instead, it provided justification for the kingdom's complete erasure from history. Every kingdom has secrets. Silvania's secret was religious heresy, the kind that could justify annihilation. For 2 centuries they'd hidden it successfully. In July 1347, King Vladislav IV exposed it in a moment of desperation. That decision doomed not just his dynasty, but its memory. Once word of the heretical ritual reached Rome, Silvania's fate was sealed. The kingdom would be conquered, its people scattered, its archives destroyed, and its very existence systematically erased from the historical record. August 1347 brought summer heat to the dying kingdom. In the capital, Silvapur, the smell of death had become so pervasive that survivors tied cloth soaked in vinegar over their faces when venturing outdoors. Mass graves outside the city walls were dug daily, filled daily, and covered with lime to slow decomposition. The population that had numbered 15,000 in January now barely reached 7,000, and that number decreased every day. Church bells, which had once marked hours and celebrations, now rang constantly for the dead. Priests who hadn't fled struggled to perform burial rites for the overwhelming numbers. Many bodies received no ceremony at all, simply being dragged to the pits by exhausted gravediggers who knew they'd likely join the corpses within days. Markets had closed. Food became scarce as supply routes collapsed, and farmers either died or fled their fields. The careful social order that had defined urban medieval life disintegrated into something more primitive: survival, fear, desperation. Hungarian forces advanced to within 30 kilometers of the capital. They moved slowly, deliberately, letting plague do their work for them. Why risk soldiers in an assault when disease was destroying the city more efficiently than any siege? In mid-August, King Vladislav made a decision that must have broken his heart. He sent his pregnant wife, Queen Isabella, and their 2 children to a remote monastery deep in the Carpathian Mountains. The monastery was isolated, accessible only through narrow mountain passes, and had so far remained untouched by plague. If anywhere was safe, it would be there. The king remained in Silvapur, believing his duty required him to stay with his dying city. But he couldn't watch his children die if there was any chance they might survive. The farewell was documented by a monk who accompanied the queen. He described the king holding his son for a long moment, whispering something in his ear. Princess Elena cried, sensing something terrible in the goodbye. The queen, 7 months pregnant and already showing signs of illness, kissed her husband, knowing she'd likely never see him again. September brought no relief. The plague's intensity began to wane slightly, not because it was defeated, but because it had killed most susceptible hosts. The Hungarian army reached the outskirts of Silvapur but didn't immediately attack. They waited, watching, allowing the disease to complete its work. King Vladislav, now visibly ill himself with the early symptoms of plague, fever, weakness, swollen lymph nodes, attempted a final negotiation. He sent envoys to the Hungarian camp with an extraordinary offer: complete surrender. Hungary could have the kingdom, the territory, the mines, the trade routes, everything. In exchange, he asked only that his people be treated mercifully and his children be given safe passage to Poland, where Isabella's family might protect them. Hungary's response was absolute. Unconditional surrender, yes, but with conditions that made surrender meaningless. The king must submit to trial for heresy. All members of the royal family would be taken into protective custody. All Silvanian nobles who had participated in or tolerated heretical practices would face church investigation. Vladislav knew what these terms meant. Trial for heresy meant execution, likely by burning. Protective custody of his children meant they'd be imprisoned or killed to eliminate any future claimants to Silvanian identity. He refused the terms. If he was going to die, and he was clearly dying, he would at least deny Hungary the satisfaction of a public execution and the legitimacy that capturing the royal family alive would provide. October arrived with autumn cold. The city's remaining population, perhaps 3,000 people, began simply leaving. Not in organized evacuations, but in desperate individual decisions. Families gathered what belongings they could carry and fled into the forests, hoping to reach other kingdoms, other cities, anywhere but the plague-ridden capital awaiting Hungarian occupation. Some walked toward Poland, others toward Bohemia. Many died on the roads, their bodies left where they fell. King Vladislav, now confined to his bed in the palace with advanced plague symptoms, made his final decision. He wouldn't let his kingdom's records, its culture, its administrative heritage fall into Hungarian hands. If they couldn't preserve Silvania as a living kingdom, they would at least prevent it from being claimed and distorted by conquerors. He ordered his few remaining loyal guards, perhaps 20 men, to burn the palace archives. Everything went into the flames: tax records, trade agreements, diplomatic correspondence, royal genealogies, land grants, the entire administrative infrastructure that proved Silvania's existence as a functioning state. The crown jewels were broken apart and scattered. The royal seal was melted. Anything that could be used to claim continuity with Silvania's authority was deliberately destroyed. It was an act of final defiance and utter despair. If the kingdom must die, at least its memory wouldn't be prostituted by those who had killed it. On October 24th, 1347, King Vladislav IV died of plague in a nearly empty palace. 2 surviving servants buried him in an unmarked grave somewhere in the palace grounds. The location was never recorded and has never been found. His children, hidden in their mountain monastery, were captured by Hungarian soldiers 2 weeks later. Their mother had died of plague in September after giving birth to a stillborn child. The children were alone, orphaned, the last remnants of a dynasty that had ruled for 200 years. October 1347. The capital was empty. The king was dead. The archives were burned. The kingdom had ceased to exist. But the story doesn't end with death. It ends with something more disturbing: the systematic erasure of memory itself. Prince Vladislav was 10 years old. Princess Elena was 8. They were found in a monastery in the Carpathian Mountains in early November 1347 by Hungarian soldiers who had spent weeks searching the region for any surviving members of the royal family. The monastery's monks had tried to hide the children, dressing them in peasant clothing, claiming they were orphaned relatives of one of the brothers. But someone talked, or someone recognized them, or perhaps the children themselves were simply too distinctive, too well educated, too refined in manner to pass as common orphans. They were taken into Hungarian custody. Officially, they became wards of the crown, a legal status meant to suggest protection rather than imprisonment. The reality was different. These children represented a claim to Silvanian territory and identity. As long as they lived, the possibility existed that someone might try to restore Silvania through them, to use them as figureheads for resistance, to challenge Hungarian occupation by supporting the legitimate royal bloodline. Hungarian royal household accounts from November 1347 through March 1348 show regular expenses for 2 royal wards, payments for food, clothing, guards and accommodation. The amounts suggest the children were kept in reasonable comfort, not tortured or starved. They were valuable, after all, potentially useful as bargaining chips or symbols of Hungary's magnanimity. Then, in March 1348, the payments stop. The children disappear from all records. No death notices, no transfers to other locations, no further mentions in correspondence. They simply vanish from the historical record as completely as their kingdom had. What happened? We're left with fragments, hints, possibilities, but no certainty. The first possibility is execution. It would have been pragmatic, from Hungary's perspective. Eliminate any potential claimants. Remove any possibility of future challenges to Hungarian control of former Silvanian territory. A cryptic entry in a Hungarian monastery's death register from March 1348 lists 2 children of royal blood buried in unmarked graves. The entry gives no names, no ages, no circumstances of death. It could refer to Vladislav's children. It could refer to someone else entirely. The monastery is in western Hungary, far from where the children were last documented, which either supports or contradicts the theory, depending on how you interpret it. The second possibility is concealment. Medieval politics often dealt with inconvenient royal children by hiding them in monasteries under false identities. This preserved their lives. While eliminating their political relevance, you can't rally support for a claimant no one knows exists. Several Eastern European monasteries have 14th century records of anonymous child arrivals in 1348, described only as orphans of noble birth, placed into our care by royal command. These children would have been raised as monks or nuns, taught to forget their heritage, absorbed into religious life where their royal blood became irrelevant. The third possibility is escape. Romanian and Slovakian folklore includes persistent stories of hidden heirs from a lost kingdom. Royal children smuggled away by loyal servants and raised among common people. These stories are usually dismissed as legends, but legends often contain kernels of truth. Perhaps loyal Silvanian nobles managed to extract the children before or during their Hungarian captivity. Perhaps they were taken to Poland, where Queen Isabella's family might have protected them, despite political pressure from Hungary. Perhaps they were hidden in remote villages, their identities concealed, their royal heritage becoming a family secret, passed down through generations. Modern DNA analysis has been conducted on descendants of families in the Cluj-Napoca region who claim Silvanian royal ancestry. The results are inconclusive. The genetic markers show connections to medieval Central European nobility, but that's not specific enough to confirm or deny Silvanian heritage. Dozens of noble families crisscrossed this region over centuries. Without Silvanian royal DNA for comparison, and we have none, there's no way to definitively trace lineages. What we're left with is mystery within mystery. 2 children, documented until March 1348, then nothing. Did they die quietly, buried in unmarked graves, their lives ended to ensure political stability? Were they hidden in monasteries, living out their days in obscurity, dying as anonymous monks and nuns decades later? Did they survive in hiding, raise families, pass down stories that became folklore, and leave descendants who still live today unaware of their heritage? The honest answer is, we don't know, and perhaps we never will. The children's fate remains one of history's unsolved mysteries, a personal tragedy within the larger tragedy of Silvania's erasure. But their disappearance represents something profoundly disturbing about how history works. When powerful forces decide to erase something, they erase everything, not just kingdoms and records, but individual human lives, children who should have had futures, bloodlines that should have continued. The children of Vladislav IV vanished so completely that we can't even confirm whether they died or survived, let alone what happened to them. 2 children, last documented in March 1348. After that, silence. No graves, no records, no evidence. Their disappearance is the final, cruelest chapter in Silvania's erasure, the moment when even the possibility of continuation was eliminated. By 1350, the crisis was over. The plague had passed. Hungary occupied former Silvanian territory. The royal family was gone. Silvania could have been remembered like other plague-devastated kingdoms, tragic but historical. Instead, it was systematically erased. And that erasure tells us something disturbing about medieval power, memory, and the fragility of truth itself. Plague kills indiscriminately. It doesn't care about bloodlines, wealth, or political loyalty. A peasant and a prince die the same death, their bodies equally ravaged by fever and swelling. But what happened to Silvania's noble class between November 1347 and March 1348 wasn't indiscriminate. It was systematic, calculated, and brutally effective. King Louis I of Hungary faced a strategic problem after conquering Silvanian territory. The royal family was dead or disappeared, yes, but dozens of noble families remained landowners who controlled estates, military commanders who could organize resistance, administrators who remembered how the kingdom functioned. These people represented living connections to Silvania's past. As long as they existed, they could serve as rallying points for any future attempt to restore independence or challenge Hungarian rule. Louis's solution was to eliminate them entirely. The justification was ready-made. The accusations of heretical practices that had damned King Vladislav IV could be extended to his entire court. If the king had practiced pagan rituals, surely his nobles had participated, or at least tolerated them. Guilt by association became guilt in fact. Between November 1347 and March 1348, Hungarian soldiers systematically arrested Silvanian nobles on charges of heresy. Show trials were conducted in Buda, Hungary's capital. The proceedings followed legal formalities, but outcomes were predetermined. Evidence was manufactured or irrelevant. Testimony was coerced or fabricated. Guilty verdicts were universal. Sentences were uniform. Execution and confiscation of all property. Hungarian judicial records, which survived because victors keep documentation of their victories, document at least 47 Silvanian nobles executed during this period. The actual number was almost certainly higher. These are just the ones whose trials were officially recorded. Charges varied slightly but amounted to the same accusations: practice of sorcery, heretical beliefs, conspiracy against Christian faith, rebellion against lawful authority. Lord Dimitri, who had commanded Silvania's royal guard and fought desperately to defend the kingdom during its final months, was arrested in late November 1347. He was tortured to extract confessions about court rituals, then executed in December. His body was denied. Christian burial heretics were burned, their ashes scattered to prevent any shrine from marking their death. Lady Sophia, one of Silvania's wealthiest landowners, had managed her estates efficiently and maintained grain stores that might have helped the kingdom survive the plague winter. She was arrested in January 1348, charged with witchcraft based on testimony from servants who claimed she consulted with wise women about herbal remedies. Her trial lasted 3 days. She was burned alive in Budapest's main square, her screams serving as warning to anyone contemplating resistance. Father Gregor, the Bavarian monk who had served as King Vladislav's chief counselor and confessor, was arrested in February 1348. His case was particularly charged because he was a churchman who had allegedly enabled or participated in heretical practices. The church needed to demonstrate that even its own members faced consequences for tolerating paganism. Father Gregor was tortured extensively: waterboarding, strappado, other techniques designed to extract maximum confession while prolonging suffering. He reportedly confessed to everything they wanted, implicating dead and living nobles alike, before dying from his injuries in late February. The executions continued through early spring. Entire families were eliminated: husbands, wives, adult children. Only minors were spared execution, though their fates weren't merciful. Young children were placed in monasteries under false names, forbidden to speak of their heritage. Older children were sold into servitude, or forced into marriages that dissolved their noble status. The goal wasn't just to kill individuals, but to sever every familial, social, and legal connection to Silvania's former nobility. A few nobles escaped. Some had fled before Hungarian occupation was complete, crossing into Poland or Bohemia with whatever wealth they could carry. Others went further, disappearing into Moldavia or even Ottoman territories where Hungarian authority couldn't reach. But these survivors faced impossible choices. Claiming Silvanian noble status was dangerous, it marked them as potential heretics, possible rebels, and attracted unwanted attention from authorities. Most chose silence, letting their heritage become private family knowledge rather than public identity. By spring 1348, Silvania's noble class had been effectively annihilated. Every major landowner, every military commander, every administrator who could remember how the kingdom functioned dead, fled, or silenced. The social and political infrastructure that had sustained the kingdom for 2 centuries was gone. This wasn't just conquest. Conquest involves defeating an enemy and incorporating their territory. This was cultural genocide, the deliberate elimination of everyone who could maintain or transmit Silvanian identity. Hungary didn't just want the land. They wanted to ensure that no one could ever credibly claim Silvania had been a legitimate kingdom worth remembering. Plague killed indiscriminately, but Hungary killed strategically. Every noble family, every person who remembered Silvania's glory, eliminated. And this was only the beginning of the erasure. But killing the nobles wasn't enough. As long as churches kept records, as long as monasteries held chronicles, as long as documents existed in archives, someone could prove Silvania had existed. And so began the second phase of erasure, the destruction of written memory. And for this, Hungary had powerful allies. The Catholic Church in the 14th century wasn't a monolithic organization with unified policies. It was a vast bureaucracy spread across Europe, consisting of thousands of bishops, priests, monks, and scribes who maintained records, copied manuscripts, and preserved the documentary heritage of Christendom. When that bureaucracy decided something shouldn't be remembered, it didn't need dramatic book burnings or obvious destruction. It simply stopped copying. Following the accusations of heresy against King Vladislav IV in 1347, Pope Clement VI issued a confidential directive to regional bishops, overseeing territories near or connected to former Silvania. The directive, fragments of which survive in Vatican archives, instructed that documents mentioning Silvania should be corrected to remove references to the kingdom's independent status. The kingdom was to be referred to, if at all, as disputed territories or eastern forest lands under the legitimate authority of neighbouring Christian monarchs. This wasn't unprecedented. The Church had performed similar historical corrections with other heretical groups. The Cathars, eliminated during the Albigensian Crusade, were systematically written out of official church history or mentioned only as cautionary examples of demonic deception. The Waldensians, persecuted across multiple regions, saw their theological writings destroyed and their communities erased from chronicles. The institutional precedent existed for treating heretical groups as unworthy of historical preservation. But Silvania's erasure was more thorough because it served multiple overlapping interests. It pleased Hungary, a loyal Catholic kingdom whose support the Church valued. It eliminated embarrassing evidence that the Church had tolerated heretical practices for decades if Silvania had practiced pagan rituals while receiving papal recognition that reflected badly on Rome's judgment. And it reinforced papal authority over who could be considered legitimate Christian rulers. The message was clear: kingdoms existed at the Church's pleasure, and heretical kingdoms could be unmade. The erasure process was bureaucratic rather than dramatic. Church scribes in Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia received instructions to revise historical chronicles when copying manuscripts. This was routine work. Medieval texts were constantly being copied as older parchments degraded, and scribes regularly made minor edits for clarity or to correct perceived errors. During this copying process, mentions of Kingdom of Silvania were replaced with vaguer terms: forest territories, eastern marches, lands beyond the Carpathians. Papal correspondence referencing Silvanian monarchs was edited or simply not copied into new compilations. Genealogical records were altered to remove Silvanian royal connections from European bloodlines. This gradual process left almost no evidence of deliberate destruction. No one burned libraries, no one publicly announced that Silvania was being erased. Scribes simply made choices about what to include or exclude when copying texts, and those choices consistently excluded Silvania. Over decades, as older manuscripts deteriorated and newer copies became the primary sources, the kingdom faded from documentary evidence. One piece of evidence survived purely by accident. A letter dated 1362, discovered in a Krakow archive in the 19th century, was written by Bishop Tomasz, the same bishop who had been King Vladislav IV's cousin and correspondent. In it, Tomasz complains to a fellow bishop about the directive to erase Silvanian references. He argues that erasing history is theologically questionable, that truth should be preserved even when uncomfortable, and that future scholars will be confused by gaps in the historical record. His letter expresses moral discomfort with the process, but also resignation. He knows his objection will be ignored. The letter survived only because it was misfiled in an archive, dealing with property disputes rather than theological matters. It wasn't discovered until centuries later, and even then, it was dismissed by most historians as referring to some minor administrative matter rather than evidence of systematic historical erasure. The Church's role wasn't a conspiracy of evil individuals plotting in shadows. It was an institutional process enabled by bureaucratic power and justified by religious authority. Individual scribes weren't malicious. They were following instructions from superiors who were following directives from Rome. The system functioned smoothly precisely because no one needed to question whether erasure was right or wrong. It was simply policy. By 1360, most church records in Central Europe had been corrected. By 1380, most people in neighbouring kingdoms had forgotten Silvania existed, a process aided by the fact that everyone who might remember was dead, fled, or silent. By 1400, even the name had largely vanished from living memory. The Church didn't burn Silvania's history in a bonfire. They did something more effective. They simply stopped copying it. In medieval times, when information died, it stayed dead. No printing press to preserve multiple copies. No libraries maintaining redundant archives. Just scribes deciding what deserved to be remembered. And Silvania, branded as heretical, didn't deserve memory. By 1360, most church records had been corrected. By 1380, most people had forgotten. By 1400, even the name was gone. But physical evidence remained: castles, coins, documents in private collections. And so the erasure continued, entering its third phase, the rewriting of the landscape itself. After Hungary's conquest, European cartographers faced an awkward problem. The territory formerly known as Silvania existed. It had mountains, rivers, cities, and inhabitants. But how should it be represented on maps? Leaving it blank implied unresolved territorial claims. Marking it as Silvania contradicted Hungary's narrative that the kingdom had been illegitimate. The solution was elegant. Redraw regional maps showing the territory as having always been Hungarian, Polish, or simply ambiguous forest lands with no political identity. We can trace this cartographic erasure through surviving maps. A Venetian trade map from 1289, created for merchants needing accurate information about commercial routes, clearly shows Regno Silvaniae occupying a defined territory between Bohemia and Hungary. The kingdom appears as real as any neighbouring state, marked with the same cartographic symbols indicating cities, trade routes, and political boundaries. A Hungarian royal map from 1355, just 8 years after Silvania's collapse, shows the same region labelled Eastern Hungarian territories. No mention of Silvania. No suggestion that this territory was recently acquired or contested. The map presents it as long-standing Hungarian land, as if the previous 2 centuries hadn't occurred. A Polish map from 1389 shows the region as disputed forest lands, suggesting Polish cartographers either didn't accept Hungarian claims or genuinely weren't sure who controlled the territory. But notably, they also don't mention Silvania. The kingdom has been replaced by geographical ambiguity. A German map from 1412 shows something even more striking. Nothing. The region is literally blank space between labelled kingdoms, filled with generic forest imagery but no political designation. It's as if the cartographer simply didn't know what to call it and chose silence over error. By 1450, no major European map includes any reference to Silvania. The name has vanished completely from geographical consciousness. This erasure was partly organic. Medieval cartographers copied each other extensively. If you were making a new map, you consulted existing maps and reproduced their information with minor updates. Errors multiplied through this copying process. If one influential mapmaker omitted Silvania, subsequent mapmakers would likely do the same, each one reinforcing the omission until it became standard practice. But the erasure was also deliberate. Hungary actively pressured mapmakers to use Hungarian nomenclature for the conquered territory. Royal patronage was important for cartographers. Kings and nobles paid good money for accurate maps. Cartographers who wanted Hungarian commissions learned to present geography the way Hungarian authorities preferred. Those who insisted on older naming conventions found their maps unwelcome at Hungarian courts. The physical landscape was rewritten too. Hungarian and Polish authorities systematically renamed cities, villages, and geographic features throughout former Silvanian territory. The capital, Silvapor, became Cluj to Romanian speakers and Kolosvar to Hungarian speakers, both names erasing the Silvanian origin. Smaller towns and villages received new names reflecting Hungarian, Polish, or Romanian linguistic traditions. Rivers and mountains lost their Silvanian designations and acquired new ones. Over generations, even local populations forgot the old names. If your grandparents called the town Cluj and you'd never heard the name Silvapor, why would you question it? Language shifts naturally, especially when political authorities actively promote new naming conventions and discourage old ones. The result was eerie completeness. By 1450, a traveller crossing former Silvanian territory would see castles that looked oddly ancient, roads that seemed to follow sophisticated planned routes, and ruins suggesting a once prosperous urban culture. But they would have no framework for understanding what they were seeing. The castles were attributed to various kings or dismissed as old fortifications. The roads were considered Roman remnants or natural trade routes. The ruins were unexplained or assigned to forgotten local nobles. The kingdom had become invisible in plain sight. Its physical evidence remained, but the conceptual framework for interpreting that evidence was gone. Without maps marking Silvania, without names connecting places to the kingdom's identity, without any geographic memory of its existence, the landscape itself became mute. Within 100 years, Silvania disappeared from maps. Its cities were renamed, its borders were redrawn, its geography was rewritten. If you travelled through the region in 1450, you'd see clear evidence of past civilization. But you'd never know a kingdom once stood there. It had become ghost geography, present but invisible, real but forgotten. By 1450, Silvania had been erased from official history, church records, and maps. But one final problem remained: physical evidence. Ruins, coins, artifacts, objects that could prove the kingdom existed. And so began the final phase of erasure, the most disturbing one: the creation of false histories to explain away inconvenient evidence. Destroying evidence is difficult and obvious. Burned books leave ash. Demolished buildings leave rubble. Erased records leave gaps that invite questions. But creating a more believable story to replace the truth, that's elegant. That works. As Hungarian and Polish authorities consolidated control over former Silvanian territory in the late 14th and 15th centuries, they encountered a practical problem. The region contained substantial physical evidence of sophisticated medieval civilization castles that showed clear signs of coordinated defensive planning, fortifications built according to consistent architectural principles, urban infrastructure suggesting centralized administration, roads connecting settlements in patterns that implied strategic design rather than organic growth. Local populations asked obvious questions. Who built this castle overlooking the valley? Why are there ruins of what appears to be a palace in this forest clearing? What kingdom minted these coins we occasionally find in old buildings? Simply responding, "We don't know," would invite speculation. Worse, it might prompt people to seek answers, potentially discovering uncomfortable truths about the region's actual history. The solution was to manufacture plausible alternative histories that explained physical evidence while eliminating any reference to Silvania. Castle ruins near modern Cluj, clearly medieval in construction, with architectural features dating to the 13th century, were attributed to ancient Roman fortifications. This explanation was absurd to anyone with architectural knowledge. Roman and medieval construction techniques are distinctly different, but most people weren't. Architects. The official narrative claimed these were remnants of Rome's Dacian conquests, conveniently explaining why they existed without requiring acknowledgement of any medieval kingdom. Linguistic evidence presented another challenge. Place names throughout the region contained roots that didn't derive from Hungarian, Polish, or Romanian languages. Dozens of villages with names incorporating silver or van clearly suggested systematic naming by some centralized authority. The official explanation: these were Hungarian settlements from the 13th century using Latin naming conventions. To support this claim, Hungarian authorities commissioned documents, land grants, royal charters, settlement records that were carefully backdated and inserted into archives. These forgeries were sophisticated enough that many survived modern scrutiny for decades before linguistic analysis and carbon dating exposed them as falsifications. Coins bearing unidentified royal symbols were another persistent problem. Agricultural workers periodically unearthed silver and copper coins with inscriptions that matched no known Hungarian, Polish, or Bohemian monarch. Rather than investigating this mystery, authorities declared these coins were minted by local Hungarian nobles, exercising regional privileges. Technically possible under medieval law, though there was no documentary evidence these specific nobles ever existed. Most creatively, several 15th century Hungarian chroniclers wrote elaborate accounts describing the region as having been primitive wilderness until Hungarian colonization in the 1340s and 1350s. These chronicles described noble Hungarian settlers bravely venturing into dangerous forests, establishing order among scattered pagan populations, and building the castles and towns that future generations would inherit. The timing was carefully chosen. Placing Hungarian settlement exactly when Silvania collapsed meant any evidence of prior civilization could be attributed to these brave colonizers. These false histories became official narratives. They were copied into academic works. Church authorities endorsed them. Subsequent historians, finding consistent documentation across multiple sources, accepted them as truth. The forgeries worked because they filled a vacuum in the absence of contradictory evidence. Plausible narratives become facts through repetition. Modern forensic historical analysis can detect these falsifications. Architectural studies show construction techniques that don't match Roman engineering. Carbon dating reveals 13th century documents were actually created in the 15th century. Linguistic analysis identifies place names that predate claimed Hungarian settlement. Numismatic experts recognize coin designs that don't match known Hungarian noble patterns. But these detection methods didn't exist in the 15th, 16th, or even 19th centuries. For 600 years, historians accepted the Hungarian narrative because it seemed adequately documented and no obvious alternative existed. Textbooks taught students that the region between Hungary and Poland was sparsely populated until Hungarian expansion. University professors lectured about Hungarian colonization of wilderness territories. The false history became truth through institutional endorsement and academic repetition. This is the most insidious aspect of historical erasure. Physical destruction is crude and incomplete, something always survives. But replacing truth with believable falsehood? That's devastatingly effective. You don't fight against absence of information. You accept information that seems legitimate. The lie becomes stronger than truth because the lie has documentation, institutional support, and academic credibility behind it. Hungary didn't just erase Silvania. They wrote a new history to replace it, complete with manufactured evidence, official endorsement, and academic legitimacy. And for 6 centuries, everyone believed the lie. The most effective way to erase history isn't to destroy evidence, it's to create a more believable story. Hungary understood this perfectly, and it worked. But falsifying history requires collaboration. It requires institutions working together to suppress inconvenient truths. And in 15th century Europe, one institution had the power to enforce historical narratives across kingdoms: the Catholic Church. What we're about to reveal suggests the Church didn't just tolerate Silvania's erasure, they actively orchestrated it. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, historically known as the Secret Archives, until the name change in 2019, contain over 85 kilometers of shelving holding documents spanning 12 centuries. Not everything in these archives is genuinely secret in the conspiratorial sense. Most contents are simply administrative records, financial documents, and routine correspondence that remain restricted because processing and cataloguing such vast holdings takes centuries. But some documents were kept secret for reasons that had nothing to do with administrative backlog. In 2003, during a limited scholarly access period granted to researchers studying 14th century papal finances, a historian from Jagiellonian University in Krakow was examining ledgers related to papal revenues from Central European dioceses. While cross-referencing expenditure records, he noticed footnoted references to something called the Silvanian matter, with associated costs for scribal corrections and chronicle revisions. Intrigued, he requested access to related correspondence. What he found was a leather-bound volume containing letters, directives, and memoranda from 1347 to 1365 dealing explicitly with the erasure of Silvania from historical records. The documents were written in Latin, with certain passages in code, a common practice for sensitive church correspondence, where writers wanted official records to exist, but preferred that casual readers couldn't understand everything. The coded sections used a substitution cipher that was standard for 14th century papal correspondence and was eventually deciphered. The first document was a letter dated October 1347 from Pope Clement VI to King Louis I of Hungary. It explicitly encouraged the conquest of heretical territories in the Carpathian region, offering spiritual and political support for Hungarian expansion. The letter's language was careful but clear. Silvania's heretical practices had stripped it of legitimacy, and Hungary's actions would be considered righteous correction rather than unjust conquest. A postscript, written in the coded script, stated that no record of their independent sovereignty should survive correction. A 1352 directive to regional bishops in Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia instructed revision of chronicles and registers to remove legitimacy from the false kingdom. The directive provided specific guidance. References to Kingdom of Silvania should be changed to disputed territories or forest lands. Royal titles should be downgraded to noble ranks. Papal recognition of Silvanian sovereignty should be omitted from copies of papal bulls. A 1361 letter discussed financial arrangements for the revision campaign. The Church would fund scribes and copyists to create corrected versions of historical chronicles, with priority given to documents held in major monasteries and cathedral libraries. Payments were listed by diocese, with substantial sums allocated to regions where Silvanian references were most common. Most damningly, a 1365 memorandum reviewed the success of the erasure campaign. The writer, a cardinal whose name was encoded but has since been identified as Cardinal Bertrand, reported that the erasure has been successful. Few now remember the Forest Kingdom's name, and in another generation, none shall. The corrected histories are being accepted as authoritative. Our scribes report minimal questioning of the revisions. The researcher who discovered these documents immediately recognized their historical significance. He attempted to publish his findings, but encountered institutional resistance. The Vatican initially denied permission to publish, citing concerns about contextual misinterpretation, arguing that modern readers might not understand 14th century political realities and would unfairly judge the Church by contemporary standards. Years of legal pressure and academic advocacy followed. The researcher found allies among historians who believed archival transparency was essential regardless of uncomfortable revelations. International academic organizations applied pressure. Media attention gradually built around the story of forbidden documents about a lost kingdom. In 2008, the Vatican relented and released the documents for scholarly publication. Even then, the findings received surprisingly limited attention. Major historical journals published the documents with appropriate scholarly analysis, but broader academic and public interest remained muted. Part of this was timing. 2008 was financially tumultuous, and historical discoveries about medieval kingdoms struggled for attention. Part was institutional inertia. History textbooks and curricula are slow to change, especially when changes require acknowledging that established narratives were wrong. But the deepest reason was psychological. The documents challenged fundamental assumptions about how historical knowledge is constructed and preserved. Accepting that an entire kingdom could be systematically erased by institutional conspiracy required accepting that history itself is more fragile and manipulable than we prefer to believe. Most historians found it easier to acknowledge Silvania's erasure as an interesting footnote rather than confronting its implications for historical epistemology. The documents exist. They've been published, translated, and analyzed. They prove beyond reasonable doubt that Silvania's erasure was deliberate, coordinated, and executed by the medieval church as a political strategy to support Hungarian expansion and eliminate embarrassing evidence of the church tolerating heresy. In 2003, a historian opened a 650-year-old volume in the Vatican archives. Inside were letters proving something extraordinary. Silvania's erasure wasn't accidental. It was planned, coordinated, and executed by the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, and they documented everything. The Vatican documents prove institutional conspiracy. But institutions are made of individuals, and sometimes individuals rebel. Sometimes people refuse to let memory die. Which brings us to the most fascinating aspect of Silvania's story: the people who tried to preserve its memory despite every force working against them. Erasure is never complete. No matter how powerful the institutions, no matter how coordinated the campaign, there are always rebels, people who hide documents, who whisper stories to their children, who leave coded messages for future generations hoping someone will eventually understand. The Polish bishop who objected to the erasure directive in 1362 did more than write a letter of protest. Bishop Tomasz, who had been King Vladislav IV's cousin and correspondent, knew his objection would be ignored by church authorities, so he took matters into his own hands. He secretly commissioned a monk named Brother Jerzy to create a true chronicle of Central European history, explicitly including Silvania's full account. Brother Jerzy worked in secret between 1365 and 1370, compiling information from documents that hadn't yet been destroyed or revised, interviewing refugees from Silvania who had fled to Poland, and recording everything the bishop could remember from his correspondence with the Silvanian king. The resulting chronicle was approximately 300 pages of dense medieval Latin, containing genealogies of the 9 kings, descriptions of political events, accounts of culture and daily life, and even transcriptions of letters that no longer existed elsewhere. Brother Jerzy hid the chronicle in a monastery library in Krakow, placed in a section dealing with obscure theological commentaries, where it was unlikely to be noticed by anyone conducting political censorship. It remained there, forgotten but preserved, until 1987, when a graduate student researching medieval manuscript collections stumbled upon it. The discovery sparked the initial modern academic interest in Silvania. But Brother Jerzy wasn't alone. Evidence suggests a small network of preservationists existed across Central Europe, people who recognized what was happening and made conscious decisions to resist. Monastic correspondence from the late 14th century contains cryptic references that make more sense when understood as coded discussions about preservation efforts. A 1374 letter between 2 abbots mentions safeguarding materials related to corrected histories and ensuring future generations may access truth. Marginalia in certain manuscript copies note things like, "The official version omits," or "The true account differs from this chronicle." These tiny rebellions represented real personal risk. Being caught with heretical or false historical records could result in excommunication or worse. Brother Andreas, a German monk in Bavaria, hid a collection of Silvanian documents in a sealed compartment he constructed behind a chapel altar in his monastery. The compartment was only discovered during 1992's renovations, when workers removing damaged altar stones found the hidden space. Inside were letters, land grants, and administrative records from Silvania's final decade's documents that shouldn't have survived the erasure, but did, because one monk risked everything to preserve them. Lady Katarina, a Polish noblewoman whose grandmother had fled Silvania during the 1347 collapse, maintained detailed oral traditions about her ancestry, despite official prohibitions against discussing Silvanian heritage. She taught her children and grandchildren family history, including descriptions of life in Silvapur, stories about the 9 kings, and even fragments of what might have been Silvanian language or dialect. Her descendants preserved these traditions across generations, treating them as precious family secrets. Some of these oral histories were eventually recorded in the 17th century by one of her descendants, providing valuable corroboration of documentary evidence. Perhaps most poignantly, an anonymous scribe working on Hungarian royal chronicles in the 1382 included tiny, almost invisible footnotes in his copies. Written in minuscule script in the margins, these notes acknowledged that this account has been corrected by royal decree, or the prior version of this history differed substantially. The scribe knew his footnotes might never be read, might be dismissed even if noticed, but he left them anyway, tiny markers of truth in an ocean of authorized lies. These preservationists had no way to know whether their efforts would matter. They had no guarantee future generations would find their hidden documents or value their secret chronicles. They acted from principle, from belief that truth deserved preservation, even when powerful forces wanted it buried. Erasure is never complete, because there are always rebels. Silvania's memory survived in margins, in whispers, in sealed rooms behind chapel altars, waiting centuries for someone to find it. These underground preservationists kept fragments of Silvania's memory alive. But fragments aren't enough to reconstruct history. That required something else. Modern archaeology, genetic science, and most importantly, a new generation of historians willing to challenge official narratives, which brings us to the 20th and 21st centuries, when Silvania began to emerge from historical oblivion. You can erase documents. You can rewrite maps. You can revise chronicles and forge new histories. But you cannot erase the ground. And in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, archaeologists began digging in northeastern Romania and eastern Slovakia, searching for something they didn't yet know existed. The breakthrough came during the communist era, when Romanian and Slovakian governments funded extensive archaeological surveys of rural regions. The motivation was partly nationalist. Communist authorities wanted evidence of pre-Hungarian settlement to support territorial claims and national narratives about ancient indigenous populations. The irony is that nationalist politics, which had helped erase Silvania centuries earlier, now inadvertently helped rediscover it. These surveys uncovered anomalies that didn't fit established historical frameworks. Coins bearing royal symbols that matched no known Hungarian, Polish, or Bohemian monarch. Pottery styles that showed sophisticated production techniques but didn't match any documented medieval tradition in the region. Defensive fortifications in the Carpathian foothills showing engineering sophistication that predated documented Hungarian construction by decades. One excavation near Cluj in 1978 became particularly significant. Construction workers preparing ground for a factory complex uncovered what appeared to be medieval foundations. Archaeologists were called in and began careful excavation of what proved to be a large palace complex, extensive enough to suggest royal or high noble residence. The structure included a great hall, residential quarters, administrative buildings, and a chapel with architectural features that puzzled researchers. The chapel blended Romanesque and Eastern Orthodox styles in ways not found elsewhere in the region. Western European architectural elements mixed with Byzantine influences, suggesting a culture that drew from both traditions simultaneously. Carbon dating of wooden structural elements and analysis of mortar composition placed construction between 1,180 and 1,220, a period when established, history claimed the region was sparsely populated, wilderness awaiting, Hungarian colonization. Most compelling were inscriptions carved into foundation stones. Latin text, weathered but readable. Anno Domini 1189. Rex Vladislavus II. Year of our Lord 1189. King Vladislav II. But there was no King Vladislav II in any known genealogy. Hungarian authorities initially dismissed the finding as misidentified, perhaps a local noble who pretentiously used royal titles, or a mistranslation of the inscription. But similar discoveries kept emerging. Another excavation 50 kilometers away uncovered a fortified manor with coins bearing identical royal symbols. A third site revealed a chapel with similar architectural hybridization. A fourth found pottery marked with what appeared to be royal seals. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Multiple sites across a geographically coherent region, all showing similar architectural styles, all dating to the same period, all containing evidence of a centralized authority that official history claimed didn't exist. In the 1,990 seconds after the fall of communism, archaeological research became less constrained by nationalist political pressures. Researchers from Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Western European institutions began collaborating, sharing findings, and conducting joint investigations. Academic journals published studies noting the anomalies and cautiously suggesting the region might have supported a previously unknown medieval political entity. The evidence accumulated. Mass graves from the 1,340 seconds containing hundreds of bodies showing signs of plague death. Urban infrastructure suggesting planned city development rather than organic village growth. Trade goods from Venice, the Baltic, and Constantinople concentrated in patterns indicating this region was a trade hub. Road systems showing strategic planning that wouldn't make sense unless coordinated by centralized authority. Museums across Romania now hold collections of these artifacts: coins, pottery, architectural fragments, metalwork, religious objects. Most are labelled generically as medieval artifacts from central Romania, without mentioning Silvania, either because curators remain skeptical of revisionist history, or because acknowledging Silvania would require rewriting entire exhibitions and challenging decades of established interpretation. The physical evidence is undeniable. Something substantial existed in this region during the period Silvania supposedly thrived, something with royal pretensions, architectural sophistication, and economic prosperity, something that disappeared around 1347 and was subsequently written out of history. You can erase documents, you can rewrite maps, but you cannot erase the ground, and what the ground reveals is a kingdom that existed, thrived, and was forgotten. Archaeology proved Silvania existed. But physical ruins don't tell us who lived there, what happened to the survivors, or whether any descendants remain. For that, we needed another kind of science, one that reads history written in blood itself. We needed DNA. DNA doesn't lie. It carries information across centuries, immune to document burning and cartographic revision. And in 2017, population geneticists studying Central and Eastern European genetic diversity discovered something they couldn't easily explain. The research was routine, analysing modern populations to understand medieval migration patterns, plague impacts, and ethnic mixing. Researchers collected DNA samples from volunteers across Romania, Slovakia, Poland, and Ukraine, looking for patterns that correlated with known historical events. What they found in northeastern Romania and eastern Slovakia was unexpected, a genetic cluster showing unusual characteristics. The population displayed mixed Hungarian, Slavic, and distinct medieval European markers, but the combination didn't match any known migration pattern. It was as if a separate population had once existed in this region, intermixed with surrounding groups, then largely disappeared, leaving only fragmentary genetic traces. The study then analysed DNA extracted from skeletal remains in medieval burial sites, including mass graves from the 1,342, likely plague victims based on burial patterns and historical context. These medieval samples showed a distinct genetic profile that appeared in the modern population at much lower frequencies than would be expected through normal demographic continuity. The pattern suggested population catastrophe and dispersal. A substantial group of people living in the region in 1340 had largely vanished from the genetic record by 1360, with only scattered descendants remaining. The timeline matched Silvania's collapse exactly. Even more intriguing was the discovery of potential modern descendants, individuals whose genetic markers suggested ancestry from this vanished medieval population. Some lived in Romania and Slovakia, near former Silvanian territory. Others had ancestral roots in Poland, Moldavia, and western Ukraine, regions where Silvanian refugees might have fled. Several individuals have come forward claiming Silvanian royal ancestry based on family legends and genetic testing results. A Romanian family near Cluj has maintained oral traditions for generations about being descended from the last king's cousin who fled during the Great Dying. Their family stories describe a royal ancestor who escaped Hungarian persecution, changed his name, and established a new life among common people. DNA testing shows they carry rare genetic markers consistent with medieval Central European nobility, though whether this specifically connects to Silvanian royalty remains scientifically unproven. A family in Slovakia possesses a document, carbon dated to the 15th century, claiming their ancestor was a Silvanian noble named Lord Mikhail, who survived by concealing his identity and living as a merchant. The document describes how he changed his name, burned his family records, and instructed his children to forget their heritage for safety. Yet he wrote this account anyway, hiding it for future generations, perhaps hoping circumstances would change and his descendants could reclaim their legacy. The family carrying this document shows genetic markers suggesting noble medieval ancestry, though again, definitive proof of Silvanian connection remains elusive. The genetic evidence doesn't conclusively prove these specific individuals descend from Silvanian royalty. Medieval nobility intermarried extensively, and genetic markers associated with noble lineages are scattered across Eastern Europe. Without DNA from confirmed Silvanian royal remains, and we have non-precise lineage tracing, is impossible. But what genetics does prove is broader and perhaps more significant. A distinct population group existed in the region from approximately 1,150 to 1,350. This population experienced catastrophic decline around 1,347. survivors dispersed to surrounding regions, where their descendants remain today, carrying genetic evidence of ancestry from a place and people that official history claimed never existed. These descendants walk among us, Romanians, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians who carry in their DNA the memory of a vanished kingdom. Most have no idea. Their family stories have been forgotten or dismissed as fantasy. Their genetic heritage is invisible without specialized testing. But the blood of Silvania survives. The kingdom was erased from maps and chronicles, but its people's genetic legacy persists, scattered across Central Europe, waiting to be recognized. DNA doesn't lie. In 2017, geneticists discovered a ghost population that lived in Central Europe in 1340, but had vanished by 1360. Their descendants might still be alive today, carrying the blood of the erased kingdom, completely unaware of their heritage. So we have archaeological evidence, genetic studies, hidden documents, and Vatican archives all pointing to the same conclusion. Silvania existed, thrived, and was systematically erased. But one question remains. Why has it taken 675 years for this story to emerge? Why now? The answer reveals something disturbing about how we construct historical truth. The evidence of Silvania's existence wasn't hidden in inaccessible vaults or buried in unmarked graves. It was scattered across archives, visible in archaeological anomalies, documented in fragmentary sources that historians had access to for decades. Yet the kingdom remained forgotten until recently. Why? The answer reveals how historical truth is constructed, accepted, and maintained through mechanisms more subtle than deliberate conspiracy. First, institutional inertia. Once a historical narrative becomes established in academic consensus, challenging it requires extraordinary evidence. Medieval Central European history had been written, taught, and refined for centuries. The established story, Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia, as the dominant powers, with minor principalities and contested borderlands between them, was clean, comprehensible, and adequately documented. Anomalies that didn't fit this framework weren't seen as pieces of a missing puzzle, but as exceptions requiring explanation. Strange coins, probably minted by forgotten local nobles. Unusual architecture, likely misidentified or misdated. Fragmentary documents, mentioning unknown kingdoms. Probably scribal errors or references to temporary political arrangements too minor to warrant detailed study. Second, nationalist bias shaped 20th century historiography. Romanian, Hungarian, and Slovak historians worked within national narratives, emphasizing their own people's historical greatness and territorial legitimacy. Discovering a lost kingdom that complicated modern borders and challenged national origin stories wasn't professionally rewarding. Romanian scholars wanted evidence of ancient Dacian civilization. Hungarian scholars wanted proof of medieval Hungarian cultural dominance. Slovak scholars wanted validation of Slovak historical identity distinct from Hungarian rule. None were incentivized to reconstruct a multi-ethnic kingdom that belonged to none of their national narratives. Third, source availability restricted research possibilities. Most relevant documents remained inaccessible until recently. Communist governments controlled archival access and restricted foreign researchers. The Vatican only began opening sensitive 14th century correspondence to scholars in the late 20th century. Private collections holding hidden documents weren't catalogued or available for academic study. Researchers couldn't assemble complete pictures because puzzle pieces were scattered across restricted archives in multiple countries. Fourth, linguistic barriers prevented synthesis. Documents about Silvania are written in Latin, Hungarian, Polish, Romanian, Slovak, and German, scattered across archives in half a dozen countries. Comprehensive research required expertise in multiple medieval languages and access to archives across borders that were often closed during the Cold War. Few scholars possessed both the linguistic capability and institutional access necessary for such cross-border, multilingual investigation. Fifth, and most profoundly, paradigm blindness prevented recognition. Historians weren't looking for a lost kingdom because the possibility seemed absurd. Medieval Europe was exhaustively documented. Major kingdoms were known. The idea that an entire nation could be erased so completely that even scholars forgot it existed contradicted fundamental assumptions about historical preservation. So when evidence appeared, it was explained within existing frameworks rather than used to challenge those frameworks. Thomas Kuhn described how scientific paradigms shift, slowly, with resistance, until accumulated anomalies force reconsideration of fundamental assumptions. The same process applies to historical understanding. For centuries, historians worked within a paradigm assuming that official records were generally reliable and that major political entities couldn't simply disappear from memory. Anomalies were explained away, rather than treated as evidence of paradigm failure. Silvania's rediscovery required paradigm shift. Once, researchers accepted that deliberate historical erasure was possible, that powerful institutions could successfully remove kingdoms from memory. Previously dismissed anomalies suddenly formed coherent patterns. The same evidence that had been visible for decades was reinterpreted through new frameworks, and a lost kingdom emerged from fragments. This has implications beyond Silvania. How many other anomalies in historical records might represent erased peoples, kingdoms, or events? What other stories have been successfully suppressed by institutional power? Once you accept that history can be this thoroughly rewritten, you start questioning everything. History forgot Silvania, not because evidence didn't exist. It forgot because no one was looking. When you believe official history is substantially complete, you explain away contradictions. But when you question consensus narratives, patterns emerge from chaos. Silvania isn't the only kingdom that's been erased from history. It's just the one we finally noticed. But evidence alone doesn't resurrect kingdoms. What finally pulled Silvania from historical oblivion wasn't just documents and DNA. It was people refusing to let memory die. Which brings us to the most remarkable part of this story: how a handful of modern researchers, against institutional resistance and academic skepticism, reconstructed a lost kingdom from fragments and whispers. In the mountains of Transylvania, in remote villages where electricity arrived late and tradition dies slowly, grandmothers still tell stories that historians dismissed as fairy tales, stories about the vanished kingdom, stories about kings who ruled from forest palaces, stories about the year everything ended. Folklorists collecting regional traditions in the 19th and early 20th centuries noticed these recurring motifs, but treated them as generic medieval folklore allegories about plague and war, cautionary tales about the impermanence of power, mythical narratives with no historical basis. They catalogued the stories, recorded the songs, and filed them away as cultural artifacts divorced from factual history. But re-examining these traditions through the lens of Silvania's rediscovered history reveals something remarkable. They're not generic at all. They contain specific details, consistent patterns, and historical echoes that make sense only if they're preserving actual memories transmitted across centuries through oral tradition. A Romanian folktale, collected in 1889 by a folklorist studying Transylvanian peasant culture, describes King Vladislav of the Hidden Kingdom, who ruled justly over the forest people until the great sickness came from the east. And then the forest swallowed his castle, and no one remembers where it stood. The tale includes details about the king's 2 children who were taken away by foreigners, about sacred groves where rituals were performed, about silver mines in the mountains, and about the year everything changed, described as when death walked openly and armies came from the south. A Slovakian ballad recorded in 1923 tells of the royal children who fled to the mountains when their father died and were never seen again, but their descendants walk among us still, bearing the invisible mark of the crown. The ballad is sung in a minor key, mournful and haunting, and includes verses describing a great palace that stood where the 3 rivers meet, a geographical description that matches Cluj's location precisely. Ukrainian villages near the Carpathian foothills maintain traditions about the last harvest festival before the darkness, commemorated every October with rituals that blend Christian and pre-Christian elements. When asked what darkness the festival commemorates, elderly participants offer vague explanations about plague or war, but the specific date, late October, corresponds almost exactly with King Vladislav IV's death in October 1347. These stories share remarkable consistencies, despite being collected across hundreds of kilometers and multiple language groups. They mention dates near 1347. They describe Hungarian invasion. They reference royal rituals in sacred groves, exactly the heretical practices that doomed Silvania. They use names that correlate with known Silvanian monarchs: Vladislav, Elena, Stefan. They describe a kingdom that disappeared suddenly, swallowed by forest or erased from memory. The stories aren't historically precise. Centuries of oral transmission have mythologized events, added magical elements, and distorted details. King Vladislav becomes a wizard in some versions. The palace disappears through enchantment rather than deliberate destruction. The royal children transform into birds or stars rather than being captured and killed. These are the inevitable corruptions of oral tradition. Memory, preserved through narrative, requires drama, symbolism, and mythic resonance to survive. But beneath the mythological overlay, core historical truths persist. A kingdom existed, a royal family ruled, a catastrophe occurred around a specific time, foreigners invaded, the kingdom vanished. These aren't invented fantasies. They're memories, distorted by time, but rooted in actual events experienced by ancestors who pass stories to their children, who pass them to their children across 20 generations. Oral tradition preserves memory differently than written records. It's imprecise, mutable, prone to embellishment, but it's also resilient, surviving when documents are burned and archives are purged. For people systematically excluded from official historiography, peasants, refugees, descendants of the erased oral tradition was the only available medium for preserving the past. In remote villages, grandmothers still tell stories about the vanished kingdom, children still sing songs about lost princes, farmers still point to ruins in forests and whisper, "That's where the palace stood." Historians called these fairy tales for centuries. They were wrong. They were memories, preserved in the only way forbidden knowledge can survive, in whispers, in songs, in stories told by firelight to children who would tell them to their own children decades later. Oral traditions kept Silvania's memory alive in fragments scattered across mountains and generations. But fragments need someone to assemble them, to connect the dots, to fight for recognition against institutional skepticism. That person arrived in the 1992, a Romanian historian whose grandmother had told her stories about the hidden kingdom and who spent 30 years proving those stories were real. Elena Vasili was born in 1965 inches, a small town in Transylvania, where her grandmother told her bedtime stories that other children never heard. Stories about a kingdom hidden in the forests. Stories about 9 kings who ruled before everything ended. Stories about royal children who disappeared and descendants who still lived, unaware of their heritage. Her grandmother claimed their family descended from survivors who had fled when the kingdom fell. She described festivals they'd celebrated in secret, traditions they'd maintained despite risk, and memories they'd preserved when official history tried to make them forget. Young Elena loved these stories but assumed they were fairy tales, beautiful, mysterious, but ultimately fictional. Then she studied medieval history at university in Cluj, in the 1982. Reading chronicles of 14th century Central Europe, she noticed gaps, references to places that didn't exist on maps, names that matched no known rulers, administrative records suggesting territorial divisions that made no sense according to established history. Her professors explained these as scribal errors, minor anomalies, or evidence of temporary political arrangements too insignificant for detailed study. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that these anomalies connected to her grandmother's stories. Patterns emerged. The gaps clustered in specific regions and time periods. The unexplained names matched names from the bedtime tales. What if the stories weren't fairy tales? What if they were memories? Her doctoral dissertation, completed in 1995, proposed that a previously unidentified political entity had existed in northeastern Romania during the 14th century. She assembled fragmentary evidence from Romanian archives, cross-referenced place names with folklore, and argued that established historiography had missed an entire kingdom. Her academic committee rejected the thesis as speculative, lacking sufficient evidence, and relying too heavily on oral tradition rather than documentary sources. One professor called it creative fiction, masquerading as scholarship. The rejection could have ended her academic career. Instead, it focused her determination. If the evidence didn't exist in Romanian archives, she would search elsewhere. Over the next decade, she traveled to Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Germany, and Italy, piecing together fragments from scattered archives. She learned paleography to read medieval manuscripts, mastered Latin and multiple Eastern European languages, and collaborated with archaeologists excavating sites that official history couldn't explain. She interviewed descendants of families claiming Silvanian heritage, recording oral traditions that had survived in isolated communities. She conducted linguistic analysis of place names, finding patterns suggesting systematic naming by centralized authority. She examined coins, pottery, and architectural remains in museum collections, identifying connections previous researchers had missed. In 2008, when the Vatican released 14th century correspondence about the Silvanian matter, Elena was among the first scholars to request access. Finding the documents that proved deliberate erasure was vindication after years of skepticism and mockery. The Vatican letters confirmed what her grandmother's stories had suggested. Silvania existed, thrived, and was systematically erased by institutional conspiracy. Her 2012 book, The Kingdom That History Forgot, presented comprehensive evidence for Silvania's existence and erasure. The academic reception was divided. Some scholars embraced her work as groundbreaking revisionist history that challenged comfortable assumptions about historical completeness. Others dismissed it as conspiracy theory based on insufficient evidence and overinterpretation of ambiguous sources. Debates raged in academic journals. Conferences featured contentious panels. Some universities invited her to lecture. Others refused to acknowledge her work. She persisted through controversy, continuing to publish research, collaborate with international colleagues, and advocate for Silvania's recognition in historical curricula. When asked why she devoted her career to a lost kingdom that most historians still disputed, she answered simply, "My grandmother's stories deserve to be taken seriously, and the people who died in 1347 deserve to be remembered." One woman spent 30 years being called obsessed, delusional, a conspiracy theorist because she believed her grandmother's fairy tales were real. In 2008, she found proof, and suddenly, everyone who had dismissed her work had to reconsider everything they thought they knew about medieval Europe. Dr. Vasilei's research proved Silvania existed, but proving existence and achieving recognition are different battles. Academic history moves slowly, textbooks aren't rewritten easily, and so, as of 2025, most history books still don't mention Silvania. Most people still don't know it existed, which raises a final question. Does a kingdom only exist if history remembers it, or does memory matter more than official recognition? The evidence exists. Archaeological sites have been excavated and documented. Genetic studies have identified descendant populations. Vatican archives have released incriminating correspondence. Oral traditions have been collected and analysed. Academic papers have been published in peer-reviewed journals. The case for Silvania's existence and erasure is compelling, built on multiple independent lines of evidence converging toward the same conclusion. Yet if you open most history textbooks on medieval Europe, you won't find Silvania mentioned. If you search Wikipedia for Kingdom of Silvania, you'll either find nothing or a page flagged as disputed, requiring additional verification, possibly unreliable. If you ask history professors about 14th century Central European kingdoms, most will list Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, and various minor principalities, but not Silvania. Why does institutional recognition lag so far behind accumulated evidence? The answer reveals how historical knowledge actually works. Changing established narratives requires consensus among scholars, publishers, and educational authorities, a conservative process resistant to rapid revision. Medieval European history has been taught for centuries, according to frameworks that don't include Silvania. Thousands of textbooks, tens of thousands of academic papers, millions of students have learned the standard narrative. Revising that narrative means acknowledging that generations of historians missed an entire kingdom, that established sources were compromised by deliberate falsification, and that oral traditions dismissed as folklore might preserve more truth than official chronicles. Additionally, Silvania's recognition challenges national historiographies with contemporary political implications. Romanian historians have built narratives emphasizing continuity from ancient Dacian civilization through modern Romania. Acknowledging a multi-ethnic medieval kingdom complicates claims about Romanian territorial legitimacy. Hungarian historians emphasize medieval Hungarian cultural dominance and expansion. Admitting that expansion involved erasing an existing kingdom rather than colonizing wilderness undermines heroic national narratives. Slovak historians focus on Slavic heritage distinct from Hungarian rule. Recognizing a kingdom that blended Hungarian, Slavic, and other influences doesn't fit cleanly into any national story. There are also legitimate scholarly concerns. Primary sources about Silvania remain fragmentary. Much evidence is circumstantial, requiring interpretation and inference. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and some historians genuinely believe the threshold hasn't been met. They worry that accepting insufficiently documented kingdoms sets dangerous precedents for historical methodology, potentially opening doors to pseudo-history and nationalist fantasies about imagined glorious pasts. The debate isn't simply between truth and institutional suppression. It's a genuine academic controversy about evidentiary standards, methodological rigor, and how to balance fragmentary sources against established frameworks. Some scholars, who resist Silvania's recognition, aren't conspiring to suppress truth. They're applying scholarly skepticism that serves important functions in preventing historical fabrication. But skepticism can become inertia. Professional investment in existing narratives creates resistance to revision. Historians who've taught the standard story for decades face uncomfortable implications if that story is substantially wrong. Publishers hesitate to revise textbooks without overwhelming consensus. Educational authorities avoid controversial topics that might generate complaints from nationalist groups invested in particular historical narratives. Recent progress suggests momentum toward eventual recognition. A 2019 conference at the University of Vienna featured multiple panels on Silvania, with scholars from 6 countries presenting evidence and debating interpretations. A 2022 Romanian museum opened an exhibition on lost medieval kingdoms of the Carpathians, featuring Silvania prominently and attracting significant public interest. Graduate students are writing dissertations on Silvanian archaeology, linguistics, and political history. Slowly, the kingdom is entering academic consciousness, but full recognition remains elusive. The gap between discovery and official acknowledgement might last decades. History textbooks will be among the last to change, requiring years of academic consensus building before publishers commit to expensive revisions. The evidence is there. The arguments are compelling. But Silvania still doesn't appear in most history books. Why? Because changing history is harder than discovering it. Institutions resist. Scholars doubt. Textbooks move slowly. The kingdom has been rediscovered by researchers, acknowledged by specialists, and documented by archaeologists. But it hasn't been fully remembered by the broader culture. Not yet. So where does that leave us? A kingdom existed. It vanished. Its memory was erased. Centuries later, fragments resurface. Researchers piece them together. Truth emerges from fragments and whispers, but history hasn't caught up with truth. Which brings us to our final question. What does Silvania's story mean not just for medieval history, but for how we understand truth, memory, and the fragility of existence itself? A medieval kingdom disappeared 7 centuries ago. Why should that matter to anyone living today? Why should we care about castles turned to ruins, about kings whose bones have long since returned to dust, about a name that most historians still dispute? The answer lies not in what Silvania was, but in what its erasure reveals about memory, power, and truth itself. First, Silvania proves the fragility of memory. We live in an age of digital permanence, where information seems immortal, where everything is archived and searchable. We assume that once something is documented, it can never be truly forgotten. Silvania demonstrates how profoundly wrong that assumption is. An entire kingdom with cities, armies, trade networks, 2 centuries of continuous government, and a population of 200,000 people was erased so completely that even scholars forgot it existed, not through natural decay or accidental loss, but through deliberate institutional action. If this happened once, it has happened before. It will happen again. How many other Silvanias exist in history's blind spots? How many peoples, cultures, and civilizations have been erased so thoroughly that we don't even know to look for them? The standard historical narrative we learn in schools represents what powerful institutions chose to preserve. Everything else is silence, and we mistake that silence for absence rather than recognizing it as suppression. Second, Silvania reveals the mechanics of institutional control over narrative. The kingdom's erasure wasn't accomplished by a conspiracy of evil individuals plotting in shadows. It was a bureaucratic process, enabled by institutional coordination. The church directed scribes to revise chronicles. Hungarian authorities commissioned false histories. Mapmakers adopted convenient nomenclature. Scholars accepted official narratives because challenging them required more effort than accepting them. This has uncomfortable modern parallels. Contemporary institutions, governments, media corporations, tech platforms, academic establishments shape narratives about current events that will become historical records. What stories are being marginalized today? What truths are being corrected through subtle editorial choices? What will future generations struggle to discover because institutional power found certain narratives inconvenient? Silvania's erasure used medieval tools, manuscript revision, cartographic omission, physical destruction. Modern erasure uses different tools, algorithmic suppression, defunding of research, ridicule of alternative narratives. But the underlying mechanism remains the same. Those with institutional power shape what becomes remembered. Third, and most hopefully, Silvania demonstrates the resilience of truth. Despite centuries of coordinated erasure, memory survived. In folklore passed from grandmother to grandchild, in documents hidden behind chapel altars by monks who risked everything, in genetic markers carried unknowingly by descendants, in ruins that refused to crumble completely, in place names that preserved linguistic echoes of a vanished culture. Truth has inertia. It resists erasure. Even when powerful forces try to bury history, fragments remain, waiting for someone brave enough to assemble them. This is Silvania's most important lesson. Truth fights back. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient persistence. A Polish bishop secretly commissioning an accurate chronicle. A German monk hiding documents for future generations. A Romanian grandmother telling stories to her granddaughter despite being told they were fairy tales. These small acts of resistance accumulated across centuries until critical mass was reached and the kingdom could be rediscovered. We face similar choices today. When we encounter narratives that seem incomplete or suspiciously convenient, do we accept official explanations or dig deeper? When we hear marginalized stories dismissed as conspiracy or folklore, do we automatically reject them or consider that they might preserve truths institutional history has forgotten? When powerful authorities insist that their version is the only version, do we trust that power or question its motives? Silvania isn't just a medieval mystery. It's a warning about memory, power, and truth. It's proof that history can be erased completely, systematically, effectively. But it's also proof that truth fights back, that memory survives against impossible odds, that fragments can be reassembled by people willing to look beyond official narratives. In an age of digital information, we assume nothing can be forgotten. Silvania reminds us, everything can be forgotten if someone powerful enough wants it erased. But it also reminds us that erasure is never complete, that truth waits patiently in shadows, and that memory matters more than institutional recognition. So what happened to the Kingdom of Silvania? The short answer: plague, invasion, heresy accusations, systematic erasure. The complete answer is more complex, more disturbing, and more relevant than any simple summary can capture. Let's revisit the full story, piece by piece, and see what we've learned. 1147. Vladislav the Wolf, bastard prince rejected by both Hungarian and Slavic nobility, carves territory from the Carpathian forests that neither kingdom wants. 1163. Papal recognition as protector of forest lands legitimizes his authority. 1175. He declares himself King Vladislav I of Silvania. The kingdom is born. For 187 years, 9 monarchs rule. Vladislav II builds the capital, Silvapur. Stefan I opens trade with the Hanseatic League, bringing prosperity. Elena I, the warrior queen, defends against Mongol raids. Mikhail I marries Byzantine royalty, strengthening eastern ties. Vladislav III presides over a golden age of culture. Stefan II fights border wars with Hungary, maintaining independence but making enemies. Andrei I restores stability through Polish alliance. Vladislav IV inherits a thriving kingdom in 1334, 1340 to 1346, 6 years of peace, prosperity, cultural achievement. The king studies philosophy, maintains a library of 300 manuscripts, corresponds with scholars across Europe. No one sees the storm approaching, except the king, whose dreams show him cities burning and memory dying. January to March, 1347. The last normal months, festivals celebrated, marriages arranged, harvests planned. Merchants bring news of distant plague, but it seems irrelevant. The kingdom feels eternal. It has 3 months left. April. Plague reaches the Balkans. Hungarian King Louis I mobilizes his army, seeing opportunity in Silvania's distraction. May. First plague deaths in Silvanian villages. Hungarian forces cross the southern border. June. Plague reaches the capital. Hungarians capture border fortresses. July. King Vladislav performs a desperate heretical ritual, hoping to save his kingdom. A spy reports to Rome and Budapest. The ritual fails. The accusation succeeds. August. Pope Clement VI issues a secret bull declaring Silvania heretical, authorizing its erasure. Plague devastates the capital. September. Hungarian army besieges Silvapore. The king sends his pregnant wife and children to a mountain monastery. The queen dies in childbirth. October. The king orders his archives burned rather than captured. On October 24th, he dies of plague. The capital empties. The kingdom ceases to exist. November. Royal children captured. 1347 to 1350. Systematic execution of Silvanian nobility. 1348 to 1365. Church-directed erasure of written records. 1350 to 1450. Cartographic erasure. Geographical renaming. Historical falsification. 1450 to 1850. 4 centuries of complete historical oblivion. Memory survives only in whispered stories. 1880s to 1980s. Fragmentary evidence discovered, dismissed as anomalies. 1990s to 2008. Dr. Vasily's research. Vatican archives opened. 2008 to 2025. Gradual academic recognition. Ongoing debate about legitimacy. From founding to flourishing to annihilation, 187 years. From erasure to rediscovery, 675 years and counting. The kingdom existed for 2 centuries. It's been forgotten for 7. And even now, most people don't know it existed. This is Silvania's complete story. So that's what happened. A kingdom rose, thrived, and vanished. Memory was erased, then recovered. But one final question remains. What becomes of Silvania now? Where does this story go from here? In 2019, a document surfaced in Prague naming a royal family that history forgot. That discovery, which opened this documentary, now makes complete sense. It wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was a fragment of a larger truth, waiting to be assembled with other fragments scattered across 7 centuries. Silvania's rediscovery is incomplete. Much remains unknown. The fate of the royal children is uncertain. The exact location of Silvapore's palace hasn't been definitively identified. Full historical recognition may require decades more of academic debate and institutional acceptance. But the kingdom is no longer erased. Its name is spoken again. Descendants are discovering their heritage through genetic testing and family research. Museums are creating exhibits about the vanished kingdom. Scholars are publishing papers, organizing conferences, training students to continue investigation. Memory is returning, slowly, against centuries of institutional resistance. In Romania and Slovakia today, people visit archaeological sites where Silvanian castles once stood. They lay flowers among the ruins. They light candles in former chapels. They create new rituals of remembrance for a kingdom that official history tried to erase. These aren't academic exercises. They're acts of reclamation, insisting that the forgotten deserve memory. Perhaps this is Silvania's true legacy, not its political achievements or economic success, but its reminder that memory matters, that truth resists erasure, and that we have responsibility to remember those who have been forgotten. A grandmother tells her granddaughter about the kingdom in the forest. The child listens, wide-eyed, asking questions. The cycle continues. Memory survives. Silvania is no longer erased. Its name is spoken. Its story is told. And perhaps that's what matters most. Not whether textbooks include it, but whether we remember. Because a kingdom only truly dies when no one speaks its name anymore. Today, we've spoken it. Silvania lives again.